Let us begin with a look at the Alliance for Women's Equality. Indisputably, this is the most influential of the feminist organizations in existence here in Russia. It has the most ideological influence on the orientation and character of Russian feminism, and, at the same time, is the left, democratic wing of the movement. When you look through their program, their platform, at first, you are overcome by affection for the radicalism of the demands of Russia's leftist feminists. They hit every note, from a constituent assembly up to and including amnesty. To say nothing universal, equal suffrage in direct, secret elections without distinction as to sex, nationality, and religion. But before we are fully overcome by affection and welcome this fact as a pleasant phenomenon, a testament to the extremely democratic character of our feminist movement, it is useful to take account of the political and social atmosphere surrounding the first forays of these equal rights campaigners into the arena of political struggle. The programmatic demands of a political organization cannot be examined without simultaneously taking into account the societal mood of the moment that dictates the positions it takes. The Alliance for Women's Equality came into being during a fever pitch of social activity in Russia. The oppositional elements of the population, awakened by the first thunderclaps of a revolutionary storm, hurried to lean on one another, to rally together, in order to resist the declining hostile forces that appeared to be retreating more reliably. That was the spring of the unforgettable, turbulent, magnificent year of 1905. In the early days of its existence, the A brought together the most diverse female elements, from solid bourgeois women up to and including socialists, but such was the gravitational force of the organization in Russian society that no one was scared off or intimidated by the principle of forming blocks. Society, which had not yet managed to awaken from the long slumber imposed upon it by the Ancien regime, felt blinded by the red dawn that had just barely begun to glimmer on the horizon, and eagerly grasped at every opportunity to show their community spirit, their autonomy. It was the dawn of the alliances. Political slogans hovered in the air, overshadowing all other demands, and the more radical, extreme, revolutionary they were, the more they resonated in people's hearts. Class antagonism, which was ever more acutely felt, seemed to be overshadowed by the passionate thirst of the entire opposition to act in friendship, as one as the liberation movement grew ever more vast. When social democracy made its existence felt and pointed out the natural boundaries that divided even the opposition into two antagonistic camps, society, i.e., the liberal democratic bourgeoisie, indignantly brushed aside the narrow doctrinaires. At the very first meeting of women in St. Petersburg on April 10, 1905, organized by the initiators of the Alliance for Women's Equality, individual incisive voices of dissonance were heard from the ranks of the Social Democrats, warning proletarian women against being distracted by bourgeois feminism and countering the resolutions of the feminists with another resolution that came from the ranks of working-class women. The feminists, who, in their peaceful, benevolent disposition, had naively imagined themselves called upon to unite at last all women under a single banner, were genuinely disappointed and saddened. Despite all their democratism and radicalism, they voted down the working women's resolution, and the assembly of, mostly bourgeois, women, of course, adopted their own resolution. 48. Such collisions of the two worlds ended up repeating themselves at nearly every major assembly of women. Nonetheless, the Alliance for Women's Equality, who were meant to serve women of all strata and classes, was organized at that same time, in April of 1905. The Alliance drafted their program amidst the incessant noise of societal forces coming to life. Life moved at an accelerated pace, the entire atmosphere seemed suffused with the revolutionary electricity that had built up over the years. The sea of women simmered uneasily, yet joyously. It is worth remembering the exhilaration that held sway amongst women over that entire year of 1905. Until last year. Zhensky calendar reports. The matter of suffrage was of quite little interest to women, in any case, that interest was not expressed in any way. Whilst, in 1903, a number of zemstva from the liberal ones to the most conservative, raised the issue of suffrage, some supporting active and passive suffrage, others supporting the expansion of existing redlegate rights of women. The latter never stated their position on the matter, as if it did not affect their essential, vested interests. Yet, last year, 1905, all of a sudden, there appeared not only interest in the issue, but uncommon upheaval and enthusiasm, which, without any propaganda, any general plan or organization, and with remarkable unanimity, made their appearance in the most diverse and opposite corners of our fatherland. 49. Women were indeed not slumbering. Petitions, resolutions, declarations, and proclamations flew through the air from one end of Russia to the other. There was no one to whom women did address an appeal. There was no issue in which these fresh-baked feminists did not intervene. There were demands for the review of the civil code in the interest of women, requests to the Home Secretary to admit women to the office of township clerk. 50. Appeals to the Zemstva, in hopes of gaining access to local government, and a motion to admit women to the treasury chambers, treasuries, state bank, etc. But, of course, the fundamental demand was political equality. Without even mentioning the declarations, motions, etc. of other women's organizations, the Russian Women's Mutual Philanthropy Society alone managed to submit 398 petitions to Zemstvo authorities and 108 petitions to city authorities seeking support for the demand for women's equality, to send 37 requests to local authorities seeking them to adopt resolutions on women's equality, to send 6,000 submissions to various social and state institutions, to submit motions requesting support for the demands for women's equality to 5 governors general, 80 governors, and 46 aristocratic leaders, not to mention the special submissions to ministers and even to the Council of Ministers. 51. For the extremely cautious, moderate, and politically indifferent women's society, even these displays of political naivete represented a sort of civic action. Most importantly, however, they were a testament to the fact that even such an arch-bourgeois women's organization did not withstand the emancipatory current, and dared to agree to such extreme measures as demands for amnesty and the abolition of the death penalty. 52. From one end of Russia to the other, women stirred, thrilled, and made their presence felt. Just have a look at newspapers from 1905, and, in practically every issue, you will run across reports of women's mass meetings, assemblies, resolutions, petitions, declarations, etc. On one day, women in St. Petersburg send a resolution on full political rights, covered with 1,208 signatures from women, to a meeting of Zemstvo officials in Moscow. 53. On the next, a group of women from Moscow, mostly teaching staff, submit to the Moscow Provincial Assembly an address asking the assembly to raise their voices for women's rights, and not to forget them when carrying out state reforms. Polish women submit a petition to the Commission for the drafting of provisions on local institutions of the Kingdom of Poland, demanding active suffrage for themselves in the future local institutions. In spring 1905, women in Saratov organize a well-attended, noisy mass meeting, after which they submit to the Provincial Assembly a declaration on the necessity of granting women active and passive suffrage in local government institutions. A similar statement is submitted to the Provincial Assembly by female residents of the city of Atkersk. Female residents of Chernigov add their signatures. Another group of women in Saratov submit the same demands to the city government of Saratov. 54. Female residents in Kishinev place an open letter in the newspaper, with 102 signatures, announcing their adherence to the demands of the women in Moscow and Saratov. In the summer of 1905, a statement from 955 is sent to the deputy mayor of Moscow, demanding that the commission, elected by the City Duma to develop the basis for the new city bylaws, recognize the principle of universal suffrage, extended to include women. Women in Voronezh submit a statement on the need to grant women the right to participate in Zemstvo. Government to the Provincial Assembly of Zemstva. The Women's Mutual Philanthropic Society sends a congratulatory telegram to the members of the Congress of Zemstvo and city officials in Moscow who speak in favor of extending the franchise to women. Female residents of Minsk organize a well-attended assembly of women, at which they issue a resolution on the need to improve the position of women and grant them equal civil and political rights to men. Mass meetings of women take place in St. Petersburg, Moscow, Odessa, Saratov, Yalta, and other cities. Wherever these meetings take place, the voices of women representing the extreme political parties are heard. The moderate voices are covered up by a chorus of rallying cries and militant slogans, expressions of enthusiasm and faith that victory is near. A close linkage is made between the matter of women's political equality and the liberation struggle of the people as a whole. Such was the political atmosphere in which the A was born, nor did the other liberal bourgeois and bourgeois democratic organizations of the time make more moderate demands. In the bloom of the alliance of alliances, the bourgeois opposition did not want to hear of property qualified representation. Is it any wonder that the A, which sought to unite the broadest possible circle of the female population under a single banner, bowed to the demanding voice of democracy in formulating their fundamental slogans? In the first paragraph of their constitution, the stated goal of the A is to support general political liberation and attain equality of rights for women and men. This is a broadly phrased objective, going well beyond the boundaries of the usual feminist organizations. But it is precisely because the stated goal of the A was to support the general political liberation of the country that they needed to reckon with the requests and demands brought forth by the political moment. In examining these aging documents of the A, their platform and constitution, we must not lose sight of the fact that many points that included in them under the influence of totally one-off historical events have now lost their significance for the members of the A, and, if they are not deleted, then only because there is a tacit understanding that they are not essential. But let us treat the program of the A as if it had not already lost its actual force, and see whether women of the working class would have been able to rally round the radical banner of the A back when its colors had not yet begun to fade, without harming their own class interests. The platform of the alliance is prefaced with the following recitals. Whereas, 1. In the present regime, women are politically completely disenfranchised, the struggle for women's rights is inextricably connected with the political struggle for the liberation of Russia. 2. The disenfranchisement of women, who constitute more than half of the population, under conditions of political liberation of only men, hinders both the economic development of the country and the growth of political consciousness amongst the people, etc. This is followed by a series of fundamental demands. Look carefully at this document. Is there even the slightest indication that the alliance intends to struggle for the liberation of women of the working class not only from civil or political disenfranchisement, but from the worst evil of the present social structure, the chains and oppression of capitalism? From its very first steps, the alliance limited their activities to political tasks. This is confirmed by the equality campaigners themselves. The alliance do not at all seek to fight for the economic liberation of women, their task is much more modest: attain equality of rights for women in elections to all legislative bodies and in the revision of the civil code. The alliance demands nothing more. But how is a woman of the working class to separate the struggle for political equality from the struggle for economic emancipation if both forms of struggle constantly intersect, adding to one another, merging into a single struggle? When a working-class woman defends her political demands, she simultaneously hastens the time of her economic emancipation, and vice versa. By defending her economic interests against exploitation by capital, she clears the path to her political emancipation at the same time. The feminists propose that she should leave the previous path of general class struggle and strictly separate economic and political interests from one another, defending the former, if at all, in the ranks of her own class, and the latter under the banner of the feminist societies. 55. But why should proletarian women throw themselves into the embrace of the equality campaigners in order to defend their political interests? Has the actually promised any extraordinary benefits for women in this regard? What was called for in the first point of the OS platform, which defined their political demands? Immediate convocation of a constituent assembly on the basis of universal suffrage in direct, secret elections without distinction as to sex, nationality, and religion, having first established the inviolacy of the person and residence, freedom of speech, the press, assembly, and association, and restored the rights of all persons deprived thereof for their political and religious convictions. We speak of the in the past tense because, in the present, their decisive desiderata have, for all practical purposes, been eliminated and replaced with more modest aspirations. What exactly remains of the previous demands of the The political face of the as with that of all bourgeois liberal organizations, has changed together with the social atmosphere. The louder the reactionaries growled, the more moderate our leftist equality campaigners became. The fact that the Alliance's previous program has not been amended is meaningless. The character of an organization must be determined based not only on its programmatic statements, but, to an even greater extent, on its practical activities, the sympathies it expresses. And the Alliance have made it ever more unmistakably clear where their sympathies lie. Whilst, in their early days, the Alliance still expressed some affinity for the Workers' Party and flirted with socialism, as the self-definition of the Alliance has progressed, their sympathy for the proletariat has faded, and their affinity for bourgeois liberalism has grown stronger. The Alliance boasted of being an organization beyond class and beyond parties, as feminists everywhere and always boast. They boasted that, in the days of the revolutionary storms, they impartially supported all types of opposition, be it bourgeois liberals, bourgeois democrats, or finally, proletarians, in a word, whatever they considered more important in a given time and place. 56. Nonetheless, in the first months of the Alliance's existence, they made undeniable advances towards the socialist parties, though, to be sure, they did not exactly know which one they preferred. At the Congress of Delegates in October, the came out in favor of the desirability of unification with the socialists, given that the interests of the working class parties relative to the current economic structure coincide with the interests of women. 57. This statement is quite decisive. It allows us to assume an understanding on the part of the equality campaigners of the link existing between the proletariat's liberation struggle and women's struggle for their rights. But we should never jump to conclusions. Under what circumstances did the Second Congress of Delegates of the take place? It coincided with turbulent days in the life of Moscow, when the wave of the Great October Strike was rising. The tempo of life was accelerated. The equality campaigners themselves note in their third bulletin, a storm could be felt in the air, nerves were extremely tense. This mood could not but influence the work of the Congress, but it also brought the beating pulse of life into it. Who was setting the tone at the time? On whose forces did society rest its hopes? Whose power was first deployed before the amazed, and even overjoyed, eyes of the bourgeois opposition, who had not yet managed to grasp the shadow side of the proletarian movement? Failing to reckon with the popular masses meant losing the battle, renouncing any chance of success ab initio. What is surprising here is not the fact that the equality campaigners struck ingratiating notes, acknowledging the proletariat as an ally with a friendly nod, at their October Congress. What is much more characteristic is the fact that, despite this flirtation with the socialist parties, the Congress decided to support other democratic organizations as well, whose platforms included the demand for political equality for women and to refrain from joining only those parties whose programs did not include this point. 58. If the had seriously gravitated towards the socialist parties in those days, if their statements had indeed been sincere, such an addendum to the resolution they adopted, an addendum that nullified that very decision, would, of course, have been impossible. What ultimately prevented the Alliance moving closer to the Workers' Party, seriously offering to collaborate with it, forming some sort of special department to serve the interests of women's democracy? Were the equality campaigners perhaps scared off by the tactics of the Social Democrats? Nothing of the sort. Oh, how the equality campaigners loved to flaunt their revolutionary attitude in those days. From calling for a constituent assembly, boycotting the Duma, up to the most active interventions. They did not shy away from anything. What, then, prevented them converging with the Workers' Party? The instinctive consciousness of class antagonism, discord, fundamental economic interests. As the alliance gradually but inexorably moved right, their aversion to the Workers' Party grew. The alliance were already making rightward steps in the first year of their existence, in 1905, of all times. Already in May 1906, a revision of the platform of the Alliance for Women's Equality, primarily the entire first point concerning the Constituent Assembly, was proposed at their Congress. Voices were raised in support of eliminating the political program of the Alliance in general. This view was justified by the fact that the emancipatory tendencies of the Alliance are a burden to its right-wing, undeveloped, frightened members, having a depressing effect on them. Mrs. Elgurovich found that the main obstacle to joining the Alliance for many members was indeed the first point. Mrs. Klyrikova and Mrs. Konstantseva insisted on shifting the center of gravity of the program from the liberation movement to women's suffrage, preserving only minimum political demands. 59. When the extreme political radicalism of the alliance was under discussion, did the esteemed delegates take into account whom exactly their political program was scaring away from the alliance, bourgeois ladies or women of the working class? Not the latter, of course. And nonetheless, despite their constant sighing about how few proletarian women are in the alliance, the need to democratize it and attract their little sisters, they once again forgot all about them even when reviewing the purely political demands. Such is the logic of the liberal bourgeoisie. Most of those at the Congress voted, however, to keep the program as is. However, we must not overestimate the significance of this fact. It is once again worth remembering the political circumstances under which the May Congress of Delegates took place. The First Duma was in its honeymoon period. The mood amongst opposition elements was cheerful, full of hope and illusions. The reactionaries hid their claws. The mood amongst the feminists was particularly triumphant and proud. They carried out their first civic act, submitting 2 petitions to the State Duma, one from the WMPS, the other from the A. Distancing themselves from their previous program was a political impossibility. It is all the more characteristic that, despite the triumphant mood of the moment, the political slogans of the A provoked attacks and doubts. It is quite instructive that, at this very Congress, along with debates on the issue of revising the program, the A was peppered with accusations of being too active in the general liberation struggle. Members of the A had apparently completely forgotten the first section of their constitution, forgotten that the A's objective was not merely the struggle for women's equality, but also support for general political liberation. Mrs. Chekhova, who today edits Soyuz Genshin, was forced to ward off these attacks and prove that the A's participation in the general political struggle did not do any harm to women's cause. 60. It was palpable that the alliance was beginning to take on an increasingly narrow feminist hue. The delegates of the Congress blasted the alliance for their ambiguous activities and their inability to steadfastly defend and carry out their fundamental task, struggle for women's rights. In the activities of other allied organizations, one male attendee said, "You can feel their character, but the Alliance for Women's Equality does not have one. Nothing can be found in their reports about the struggle for women's equality." Meanwhile, this issue should be resolved straight away, otherwise, it threatens to be postponed for a long time. Mrs. Folkenstein considered it superfluous to dedicate forces to organizing soup kitchens, helping the hungry, prisoners, unemployed, and the like, and proposes preserving forces and using them exclusively on agitation for women's rights given the importance of the current moment. Mrs. Elgurovich spoke in the same spirit. She reproached the members of the alliance for being afraid to be openly feminist. What is at fault for this, other than purely psychological causes, is the insufficient development of logic and argumentation in women. The Russian Social Democrats, too, are at fault. Babel himself does not fear the female question, whilst the Russian Social Democrats respond to it with inappropriate half-smiles and chuckles. We need to be clearly aware of the profound link between the female question and the revolutionary movement. By leaving the female question unresolved, we leave a gap for reactionaries to slip through. The Alliance for Women's Equality must defend not only their own rights, but the rights of all the people, as well. 61. The latter statement by Mrs. Gurevich is entirely correct. One can only be amazed at the political short-sightedness of those members of the who, in such a revolutionary moment, propose to abstain from any participation in the general movement and concentrate their activities on the exclusive defense of narrow female demands. In that turbulent, revolutionary year of 1905, the did indeed depart the shores of the purely female movement. A powerful wave of popular ferment carried off our equality campaigners along with the other opposition organizations. But can we hold it against the that they deviated from the immediate objectives of feminism? Do avid feminists imagine that the would have been more useful to the cause of women's political liberation if they had walled themselves off from the general liberation struggle of the people and simply gone on and on about the interests of women's equality like the proverbial magpie? The proceedings of the Alliance for Women's Equality from May 1905 to May 1906 are full of references to their supportive role in the general movement and struggle for the reform of the structure of the state. Subdivisions of the Alliance organized aid for the unemployed and striking workers in various places, opened soup kitchens, organized health brigades and clinics, aided political exiles and prisoners, participated in demonstrations, and raised funds to support the movement. Particularly active was the Moscow division of the more than 10,000 rubles passed through their hands over the year. Similarly lively was the work of the Tver division, which concentrated primarily on aid to the unemployed. Most of the divisions, captivated by the importance of the political events of the moment, in the face of which purely female interests receded to the background, dedicated themselves to working in support of the liberation movement, instinctively recognizing that the victory of women's cause depends entirely on the outcome of the people's struggle as a whole. Nor did the Bureau of the remain inactive, in addition to sending congratulations to the Finnish Senate and Finnish women, to Babel on the occasion of the introduction of a proposal for electoral reform that included women in the Prussian Landtag. We also find the Alliance actively participating in the general political arena. There was practically not a single major phenomenon of socio-political life in Russia, not a single major act of the liberation movement, with which the Bureau of the did not resonate in one way or another. 62. Surely the political activities of the merited censure from some of its members. Were they not, in fact, a testament to the political instinct present to a certain degree even in narrow champions of women's equality only? The deviation from their immediate task, the fact that they constantly left the prescribed framework of feminism, paying tribute to general political aspirations, is merely a testament to the fact that the struggle for political rights for women is so intimately connected with the general struggle for democracy that dissociating one from the other is simply impossible. The equality campaigners rose up at their May Congress against the ancillary activities of subdivisions of the Alliance in the general liberation struggle because it supposedly diverted the forces of the feminists from their immediate task, but because the revolutionism of which they boasted when the revolution was breaking out detracted in their eyes from their previous attractiveness, and prevented more solid and peaceable female bourgeois elements from joining the Alliance. Not long before the May Congress in St. Petersburg, this progressive rightward drift led the left wing of the which gravitated towards the socialist parties, to split off. The did not mourn this loss. At the Congress, to be sure, there were attempts on this occasion to revisit the relationship of the equality campaigners to the socialist parties, but the Assembly was afraid to delve into this netlesome question. It sufficed for the to give the Social Democrats their due for their idealistic preaching of women's equality. To the contrary, Mrs. Chekhova counted amongst the achievements of the Alliance the fact that, under Its influence. The Social Democrats changed their attitude towards the female question. They no longer claim that equality for women can only be achieved under a socialist system. At mass meetings and rallies, they now always speak of women's equality. 63. What is this? Conscious distortion of the facts or naive ignorance? Neither is acceptable in a person who is one of the leaders of a given social movement. Although the A still reckoned with social democracy to some extent up to the end of 1905, after a series of events that drew a clear demarcation line between the aspirations of the bourgeoisie and the working class, fear of a possible dictatorship of the proletariat led the equality campaigners to recoil in fear from all dangerous allies. Already during the elections to the First State Duma, many subdivisions of the A openly supported the People's Freedom candidates. 64. When, at the May Assembly of Delegates, the correct relationship with deputies of the State Duma, i.e., with which fraction to ally themselves, was up for discussion, the members of the alliance raised various proposals, to turn to the Cadet Party, the labor group, to establish relations with all opposition parties, but the representatives of the workers were not even mentioned, even though they had already organized their own caucus by the time the petition was submitted to the Duma. The equality campaigners ultimately submitted the petition directly to the Equality Commission. Obviously, the alliance did not want to link their activities to a party that was alien in spirit and inclinations. That the Women's Mutual Philanthropic Society selected the cadets as the expression of women's demands, that a petition from the society was submitted to Professor Petraszewski, that is entirely natural. The political sympathies of the society lean too clearly to the right, and, perhaps, if the Octobrists had promised their support to women, the society would have turned to them even more enthusiastically. However, the fact that the Alliance for Women's Equality, which claims to be politically radical, carefully avoided the extreme parties is a characteristic fact that we must not lose sight of when evaluating the nature of this women's political organization. In May 1907, the Alliance once again submitted a petition, this time to the Second State Duma, and despite the fact that, according to the equality campaigners themselves, the majority of the 20,000 signatures on the petition came from proletarian women, the petition was addressed to the Trudovik faction. This time, even the previous justification was absent. The Social Democratic faction not only was present in the Duma, but had both influence and prestige. So great was the equality campaigners' hostility to the representatives of the working class, however, that they preferred to link their actions even to the less influential Trudoviks of the Second Duma in order to avoid open relations with the representatives of the workers. The appeal to the Trudoviks was the A's last tribute to democratic traditions. As the self-definition of the equality campaigners of the Alliance grew, their cadetist leanings became ever clearer, at the same time as their hostility to the extreme parties grew. In March 1907, a sort of spiritual union was officially proclaimed between the A and the cadets. At a well-attended mass meeting organized by the A in Salt Town, St. Petersburg, only female members of the cadets appeared. The members of the State Duma invited as speakers belonged overwhelmingly to the Cadet Party. Of course, no deputies from the Workers' Party were present. Both the speeches of the speakers and the entire appearance of the audience were totally decent and ladylike. The organizers of the meeting were concerned with ensuring that the strident extremists did not introduce dissonance into the harmonious assembly, and they were quite irritated by the performance of some of the members of the party. In early 1908, members of the self-same A founded the Women's Political Club with clearly expressed cadetist sympathies. The political propaganda in the club exclusively supports the cadets. The most visible figures of the Cadet Party speak there. The link between the club and the cadets is obvious. To be sure, the club does not operate under the banner of the Alliance for Women's Equality, and the more left-leaning elements of the A emphasize this fact, noting that they are innocent of cadetism. However, not only the structure of the club, but, to an even greater degree, all of the club's activities, the entire spirit of the Alliance are a testament to their touching unity with bourgeois liberalism. In order to ascertain the extent of the evolution that has taken place within the alliance from the day of its foundation up to the appearance of their own house organ, it suffices to peruse the first bulletins of the alliance and look at the articles in its freshly baked organ. Although, in the first months of its existence, the alliance tried to assure people that even representatives of the most extreme political tendencies could walk under its banner, by 1907, the alliance dissociated itself from them and made clear that it does not share their extremism or narrowness. Of course, the alliance also adapted their tactics to their more moderate stance. We are far from the naive, short-sighted feminism, says the lead article of THIRD-WORLDISM, that dreams of solving the female question without any linkage to general political and social issues, to gain equality of rights with men independently of general legal and social equality. The tactics of our struggle for women's equality must certainly change in many particular aspects, depending, example, on the conditions of popular struggle in general. Thus, the wide range of ideas represented in the work of the First State Duma compelled us to review all Russian laws related to the matter of women's equality and submit to the corresponding commission of the Duma the draft bill for the legal equalization of women that we had written. From the First State Duma, which had raised the issue of general equality of rights, it was possible to expect a radical solution to the female question, as well. The work of the Second State Duma was no longer as broad or ideological in nature as that of the first. 65. At one time, the A sought to play an active role. At one time, it did not limit its tasks to propagandizing in favor of the idea of equal rights. At one time, did not insist that political rights for women could only be won with the active participation of the A. However, tactics must change depending on the conditions of popular struggle in general. The equality campaigners understood this proposition in their own way, and shifted their tactics almost entirely in the form of changing the alliance's relations to the Workers' Party. The intensity of these efforts to distance themselves from the Workers' Party varied along with the prevalence of the desire at any given time to blur the differences between the demands of bourgeois and proletarian women. There was a time that the OR responded with hurt and indignation when that party stated that socialist women could not and should not struggle under the flag of the alliance inasmuch as they had demands that differed from those of bourgeois women. Now, the equality campaigners of the alliance themselves emphasize their ideological divergence from social democracy, criticizing and diligently seeking out its mistakes, in a word, making clear that the alliance does not and cannot have anything in common with it. However, their hostility to that party in no way prevents the A continuing to proclaim themselves an organization that is beyond class or party and serves the interests of all women, including the most disenfranchised and deprived amongst them. Before us, says THIRD-WORLDISM, stands the woman of the countryside, that sphinx of the intelligentsia, a powerful slave with the eyes of a queen, who is obliged to submit to a slave, to be the slave of a slave, till the day she dies. We must deal with this complex position of the country woman who, at the same time, gives us an example of a self-sufficiency and an independence that we do not always have, and of profound mental and physical enslavement, upon close acquaintance with whom the blood stops flowing and the heart stops beating. And then, apparently bowing to the inevitable. Soyuz adds, let the proletarian woman struggle on her own for her rights in the ranks of the conscious proletariat, but we, the intelligentsia, raised at the expense of her blood and sweat, we must help her with all the riches of our knowledge. 66. But do not think that the A, in an outbreak of magnanimity, actually renounce the desire to lead proletarian women, that they seriously wish to let them struggle for their own rights in the ranks of the conscious proletariat. And there's the rub, the equality campaigners of the A know perfectly well, understand perfectly well, that, if they wish to be a force that society, the political parties, and the government must reckon with, then they must, above all, recruit a sufficient number of little sisters to their feminist banner, and then, relying on them, in a compelling tone, demand the satisfaction of their female demands. Hence the duplicity of their attitude towards the female proletariat, to its tasks, aspirations, and its struggle, a duplicity that is also characteristic of feminist movements abroad. On the one hand, there is a frank hostility to social democracy, its tasks and objectives, a seething bitterness towards everything to do with the Workers' Party. On the other, they borrow a number of demands from it, constantly playing with concepts and demands that are dear to the hearts of proletarian women. Listen to how the equality campaigners of the Alliance for Women's Equality speak of their tasks, and you will understand that, like sirens, they seek with their dulcet tones to catch politically inexperienced and naive women of the working class in their net. Foremost amongst all of the tasks we have set out to accomplish must be that of popularizing the idea of women's participation in universal suffrage. Only a representative body in which women legislators stand side by side with male legislators can throw off the yoke of social enslavement and liberate humanity from it. Only with the participation of women in conditions of political equality can the ideal of socialism be realized. 67. In her speech at the Amsterdam Congress, the representative of the Alliance made the socialist tasks of the even clearer. Too often, we have had to hear from the Social Democrats that the women's movement is a purely bourgeois movement, that it only serves the interests of bourgeois women, that it only struggles for political rights, and that, as soon as that goal has been attained, proletarian women will be oppressed by politically emancipated bourgeois women just as politically emancipated proletarian men are oppressed by politically emancipated bourgeois men. I do not know whether they are genuinely convinced of this, or whether this is tactic, in any case, an ill-considered one, on their part. We, for our part, must clarify this matter in the interests of unity. Without this unity, the great goal of the women's movement, equality and justice in human relations, will not be attained for quite some time yet. We must publish a sort of manifesto so that it will be impossible to divide the women's movement and obstruct its work. Suffrage is not the final objective of the women's movement. It is merely the immediate objective, the means, the lever with which to attain the main goal. The main goal, of course, is, with women's participation in the life of society and the state, to bring justice into human relations, to put an end to the division of human beings, as animals, into classes, to bring about brotherhood amongst peoples and forever to abolish the mailed fist and mutual extermination. 68. It really does seem as if the A is a supporter of the realization of the ideals of socialism, does it not? For all their hatred of social democracy, the equality campaigners nonetheless cling to the edges of the socialist banner. Renouncing socialism would mean openly acknowledging that they belong to the bourgeois world and truly alienating from themselves the element of the female population whom they must make special efforts to attract. After all, the Alliance never lose hope of rallying all democratically minded women under their banner. 69. The position of the equality campaigners under these conditions is quite difficult, but there is a way out: give up their hatred for orthodox Marxism and proclaim themselves supporters of revisionism. The benefit of this vague concept is that the most eclectic theories can be included within it, and, most importantly, it allows for the possibility of rejecting the principle of class struggle. Where orthodox Marxism sees only the irreversible current of a latent process guided by economic movements, critical socialism sees a broad arena of struggle, not only of overriding economic drives, but also of self-sufficient psychic impulses. Contrary to orthodox Marxism, which calls for a break, at least in the remote future, that is created by means of a long historical process of social foundations, critical socialism seeks to recreate. The tool that critical socialism has selected, the means of attaining its goal, is a cultural and legal struggle, broad democratism. Not only by means of economic struggle, not only by means of sharpening class instinct, not by cries of hostility and preaching of a takeover, but by means of long, insistent cultural and educational work, by awakening legal awareness, by means of broad socio-economic reform efforts, will that high degree of culture and power, holding within itself the basis of new creation, which, At the same time, is the transitional phase from democracy to socialism, be attained. 70. Thus, broad democratism is the slogan that inconspicuously replaces socialism. Cultural and educational work and a peaceful path of broad social reformism are the substitute for cries of hostility and preaching of a takeover. In a word, the unpleasant fact of class struggle is omitted and replaced by peaceful, amicable cooperation of all women, which better suits the goals of the alliance. The path to socialism, cleared of all the sharp-edged stones deliberately placed upon it by social democracy, becomes a pleasant, entirely safe trail that gradually, imperceptibly leads humanity to a goal that is remote, but, to be fair, not bad, a socialist system. Socialist ideals in themselves are not frightening, it is just social democrats, that restless, impatient party brimming with hatred for all things bourgeois, that make them dangerous. And the shares their frank hostility, blinded by class interest, they are willing to heap upon it every imaginable fabrication and libel, claiming, for example, that very many, entirely sincere supporters of the idea of equal rights, take a totally negative stance towards the so-called women's movement, to women's efforts towards the partial satisfaction of their demands and the creation of a political organization of women. They link the solution of the female question with the moment of the liquidation of the current political system and its replacement with a socialist system, and call upon women to struggle together with them for the economic emancipation of all the working masses. 71. Incidentally, let us also recall here how the representative of the Alliance for Women's Equality observed at the Amsterdam Congress that the Social Democrats prefer, with women's help, to make themselves lords over the situation, and only then grace us. And also that with the exception of Babel and a number of other distinguished people who understand the true interests of humanity and have the courage to fight for them, the party, as a whole, was indecisive, and their attitude towards us was rather more hostile than favorable. 72. It would just be interesting to know where Soyuz-Genshin came up with the idea that the party takes a totally negative stance towards the so-called women's movement and links the solution of the female question with the moment of the liquidation of the current political system and its replacement with a socialist system, that the party is rather hostile towards women, etc. Without actual facts supporting the hostility of this party to the women's liberation movement, the equality campaigners of the are forced to resort to convoluted logical constructs that allegedly lead to the conclusion that orthodox Marxism offers no justification for agitation in the interest of women's equality, or any other agitation based on legalism, or any other movement diverging from them in its understanding of historical and economic development and the evaluation of the factors on which it is based. This dismissive, and occasionally hostile attitude towards the women's movement flows quite naturally and even logically from its fundamental dogma and theoretical constructs. 73. The equality campaigners deliberately conflate bourgeois women's struggle for their narrow class rights and privileges with working class women's struggles for truly universal emancipation of women, and, having made this substitution, lightly reproach the Workers' Party for not wishing to applaud their efforts to bring about the rule of bourgeois women together with bourgeois men. Our equality campaigners, however, follow the recipe of their comrades abroad. The most radical wing of feminism abroad, too, is not averse to dreaming of a future socialist system. There, too, cooperation amongst women takes the place of class struggle. There, too, the feminists turn against the Workers' Party and cooperate ever more closely with the liberal bourgeoisie, whilst continuing to try to win over proletarian women and convince them that the theory of class struggle is an outdated and unscientific doctrine. This duplicity of feminist organizations is their most dangerous property, dangerous for the less conscious strata of the female proletarian population. If the had the courage to admit that they are an organization that exclusively serves bourgeois women, an organization that pursues democratic goals and does not seek to act as leaders of the female proletariat, it could only be welcomed as one more organization in the opposition. but, although the A has in fact long since cut off the few threads that had linked it to the people's parties in the first days of its existence, although, in practice, they adhere to the declaration of one of the prominent German feminists that we, the women of the bourgeois class, cannot support the class politics of social democracy, the alliance does not yet wish to throw off the socialist cloak it donned back in 1905. And this fact must be taken into account. The equality campaigners' deliberate blurring of their class character can do great harm to the proletarian women's movement. As such, we must undertake all efforts to strip the left-wing feminists of the socialist cover they wrap themselves in and reveal the true bourgeois face of this women's organization that claims to be cross-class and non-partisan. Women of the working class will derive the greatest benefit not from blurring the class aspirations of the various social groups of women fighting for their emancipation, but from clearly delineating these aspirations and objectives. If there is no place for proletarian women in an organization that tears up the banner of the Workers' Party whilst continuing to wave a few scraps of these banners to attract gullible and naive women's hearts, then working-class women have even less in common with another political organization of women, the Women's Progressive Party. As has already been noticed, this party is politically to the right of the alliance and even more prominently bears the imprint of bourgeois feminism. The political desires of the progressives, of course, are more modest than those of the alliance. The progressive program omits the question of struggling for general political liberation and forthrightly states that its task is struggling for the political equality of women. Based on the proposition that political equality is one of the main causes of women's enslavement, there is not a peep from the progressives about struggling with the existing socio-economic conditions that burden and oppress women to an even greater extent than political disenfranchisement. Political and civil equality, that is the slogan of the Progressive Party. And how exactly does the Women's Progressive Party define political equality for women? What are their demands? Election of legislators by all citizens having reached the age of 25 without distinction as to sex, active and passive suffrage for all citizens without regard to sex, organization of local authorities based on the same principles as the legislature. Thus, we see that the progressive program includes a demand for universal suffrage for citizens at least 25 years of age. But why do the progressives not discuss their demands in detail? Why are they silent on the question of whether active and passive suffrage for all citizens means direct and equal voting rights? Judging from the face of the party and the spirit that permeates it, the progressives, if they were sincere, would need to take a position in their program either in favor of indirect elections or in favor of unequal property qualified representation. Indirect elections are an excellent filter for elements of society that are detrimental to high politics and the most reliable way to guarantee the light of modern culture, the bourgeois intelligentsia, a place in the legislature. In increasing the voting age from 21 to 25, the Women's Party shows a doubtless tendency to introduce a restrictive principle into the determination of the legal capacity of citizens, at least in this regard. No matter how much the progressives seek to assure us that they would never dream of limiting anyone's rights. 74. Increasing the voting age shows their sympathy for property qualifications. After all, this age restriction is a sort of property qualification in itself, the full weight of which falls upon the working class, where a person's conscious life begins significantly earlier, and where political self-definition develops with greater intensity at a younger age. The cautious formulation of the fundamental demand of the program of the WPP is even more characteristic in that it was drafted at a heightened period in the political life of Russia, the spring of 1906, when no dissonance could yet be heard between the radicalism of the political slogans and the dying down of that radicalism in reality. Also striking is the extremely nebulous phrasing of another essential demand, civil equality for women. The relevant point in the program reads, the existing criminal and civil laws must be revised with the participation of women. Not a word about the basis of this revision. Meanwhile, this demand would most immediately serve the interests specifically of women of the haute bourgeoisie. Members of the WPP. The Alliance for Women's Equality not only took a more definite position, but also did more in practice on this matter. With the aid of a special commission of jurists, the Alliance reviewed a number of Russian civil laws, making amendments in the appropriate places in the interests of equalizing the civil rights of the sexes. 75. This work was submitted to the Equality Subcommittee of the First State Duma. In this sense, the Alliance proved more active in this regard than the progressives. Meanwhile, Zhensky Vystnik paid particular attention to the civil equality of women, and it could be expected that, at least this time, the progressives would throw off their customary inertia and seek to defend the principles of civil equality for women not just in words, but in deeds. The Women's Progressive Party is, as yet, a weak and passive political organization, lacking the power to defend any desires or demands of women. Perhaps this is why it did not go through the same political evolution as the Alliance. Even before the party was officially formed, some moderate feminists came together around a magazine. Zhensky Vystnik. Run by Dr. Pokrovskaya. Zhensky Vystnik never distinguished itself by political radicalism, and even in those days of October, it was at pains to maintain its objective tone and its critical attitude towards the movement of the popular masses. In the days of the hottest revolutionary battles, it managed to keep its narrow bourgeois feminist outlook intact, and none of the political storms of 1905 to 1906 caused it to respond more hotly to the events of the world around it. In a year as rich in societal sensations as 1905, even the Chronicle of Zhensky Vystnik maintained its entirely specific ladylike character as always. As if the entire world were making purely ladylike requests, as if the great liberation struggle of the people, a struggle that, incidentally, involved thousands, indeed tens of thousands of women, did not concern the representatives of feminism. Questions relevant to the lives of working-class women, of course, received minimal space. However, at that time, it seemed as if Zhensky Vystnik had no interest in allying itself or collaborating with proletarian women. To the extent that Zhensky Vystnik reacted at all to what was going on all around, it did so from an entirely distinctive perspective. Even then, this class organ of the bourgeoisie not only opposed those fighting for the political restructuring of the country, but even those who sought to improve their lot by taking strike action. We bow. Zhensky Vystnik says. Before the heroism of husbands and fathers, but, at the same time, we note that their heroics are not primarily at their own expense, but at that of wives and mothers. In point of fact, working-class men are running away from the groans of their hungry families at home. They find comfort in aggrandizing themselves by struggle, amongst their friends and comrades, and then they nip down the pub, get drunk, and go home to beat up their groaning wives and their children who cry from hunger. Wives and mothers do not have the heart to do such things. From day to day, from morning to night, they remain with their starving children, their souls tormented by their cries. We ask, who really bears the greatest burden from strikes? Wives and mothers. And under such circumstances, men dare to reproach the conservatism of women when the latter stop their husbands participating in strikes. Let husbands take upon themselves the work of sitting for half a day with their children through the hunger caused by strikes, and free their wives from their hungry cries for that time. Maybe then they will not so lightly accuse women of conservatism. Some will, of course, object that men are currently waging a struggle for freedom, for the sake of which all must make sacrifices. Though I agree that freedom is precious, I cannot agree that one must throw oneself headlong into the struggle for it, sparing nothing. I insist that, in any struggle, the number of innocent victims must be kept to a minimum. And now men, impatiently chasing the specter of freedom that has made its appearance in Russia, act as if they are fighting on an uninhabited island where no women or children will have to pay for it. 76. Need I say more? Is it not clear that right-wing feminists themselves close the door to working-class women, declaring for all to hear that they neither comprehend nor sympathize with the workers' movement? But Zhensky Vystnik only expressed itself this openly before it became the organ of a nascent feminist organization with a defined political program. The formation of the Women's Progressive Party forced even Zhensky Vystnik and individual members of the party to speak another language. In her presentations on the female question, Mrs. Vakhtina declares, "From all the above, it is clear that we narrow feminists, as Mrs. Kollontai likes to call us, do not fight at all for class interests or for the bourgeoisie, as Mrs. Kollontai says, and not even specifically for women. No, we, members of the Women's Progressive Party, fight for all humanity." 77 And Dr. Pokrovskaya even tries to provide something like a socio-political program in order to show her sympathy for the workers and her paternalistic concern for them. This program comes down to a recital of cooperativist ideals from a distinctive point of view. In convincing workers to abandon the harmful method of struggle by strike action, which only worsens the position of the working class, because it leads to increased prices for goods, as entrepreneurs and workers take losses from strikes, and then pass them on to the entire population, Pokrovskaya proposes that workers should form cooperatives, the only thing capable of saving humanity from the current economic chaos. 78. Zhensky Vystnik does not expect much of trade unions. Trade unions facilitate the development of solidarity amongst the workers, but it must at the same time be acknowledged that they contribute their part to the abundant economic chaos, given that each trade union often acts to the detriment of others. The shoemakers, for example, increased their wages by striking. The bosses pass this pay rise onto their products, meaning that workers in other trades have to pay more for shoes. They then begin demanding pay rises of their own, which affects the shoemakers, whose living conditions worsen, and the latter then have to go on strike again to increase their wages, thus increasing the cost of living accordingly. In this way, the working population runs around in a vicious circle, forever agitated and finding no way out. She goes on. Struggling against capitalism by means of strikes creates conflicts of interests between workers in different industries. A pay rise for bakers actually reduces the wages of workers of other trades. The only panacea for all these evils is cooperation, which will perhaps lead sooner to liberty, equality, and fraternity and the economic liberation of the masses than capitalism, which has grown to monstrous proportions. Pokrovskaya prescribes. Thus, Zhensky Vystnik is willing to depart from the usual framework of narrow feminist objectives and deal with socio-political questions, if for no other purpose than to show working-class women that even the progressives are pained by the needs of their poor little sisters, and to show their comprehension of the immediate demands of proletarian women. To be sure, this understanding bears a clear bourgeois imprint. The panacea that the feminists have so laboriously found is scarcely capable of inspiring enthusiasm even amongst the less conscious proletarian women, but what matters is not results, but the motives guiding the feminists. And the motives are all the same: attract working-class women to their ranks by all means necessary. In spring 1907, the Women's Progressive Party founded their own club, the purpose of which was meant to be to achieve equality of rights between women and men, mutual moral and material support, educating women, presentations, lectures for popular education, etc., providing entertainment, bringing members closer to one another to discuss and examine various questions related to their activities. However, despite their desire to recruit democratic elements amongst women, the Progressive Party itself is very selective when it comes to admitting new members to the club. To an even greater extent than the Alliance, this feminist organization views the proletariat as alien, and feels a sort of respectful fear of women of the working class. Of course, the Women's Party would like to count in its ranks those broad, agitated masses of women factory workers, but not to grant them admission to the Progressives Club. Let them sit amongst the respectable champions of equality in their silk and lace, let them debate with educated women. No, our right-wing feminists could never permit such a thing. Political calculation bows before ladylike prejudice. Can we expect much of such a political organization? From the moment their party appeared on the scene, the progressives decided to remain on strictly legal ground. Even in a period of relative freedom, when assemblies were being organized clandestinely all over the place, the progressives ran to get permission from City Hall and insisted on police officers being present during their meetings. We insisted on this to set a precedent of women's political organizations being sanctioned by the administration. 79. This method was strongly condemned by the Alliance at the time. However, if this had been the only faux pas on the progressives' part, it might have been possible to accept it. The much bigger obstacle to attracting democratic female elements to the party is their moderate political sympathies and their clearly expressed bourgeois class spirit. Where the socio-political face of the Alliance for Women's Equality places them closer to the cadets, the progressives can be likened, if not to the Octobrists, then at least to the peaceful renovationists. To be sure, the progressives take a clearly negative stance towards the activities of the Union of the Russian People, and even discuss measures and methods of struggle with the true Russian women who are struggling in the countryside not only against sedition, but against women's equality. 80. However, in entering the struggle against the Black Hundreds, the progressives doubtlessly simultaneously gravitate towards the Octobrists. When, at one meeting of the party, the question of which faction of the Third Duma a petition on equal rights should be submitted to was under discussion, Gukakov's name was bandied about together with the candidacy of Milyukov and the other cadets. Upon realizing in time that the Octobrists had in no way expressed sympathy for women's equality and never presented themselves as supporters of it, however, the progressives gave up the idea of acting through Gukakov and opted for Milyukov. This meeting took place before the Octobrists had introduced a bill on Zemstvo, self-government that also granted property-qualified voting rights to women in the Duma. One wonders how the progressives would now feel about Gukakov's candidacy. There are many reasons to think that they would have preferred to join their activities with the Octobrists. Cadetism, in the eyes of many progressives, is too radical politically. And, despite the narrow bourgeois spirit, despite the moderation of the political face of the Women's Party, this organization does not lose hope of uniting all women who sympathize with the cause of women's emancipation under its banner. In their defense of the idea of uniting women, Zhensky Vystnik gives the palm of primacy in the struggle for equality to representatives of the bourgeois class. It is only natural that feminism first arose amongst women of the intelligentsia. A simple, ignorant woman who leads a life full of great deprivations, humiliations, abuses, insults, and all manner of outrages is not capable of considering why her life is this way. As a result, she either obeys slavishly, or, in some individual cases, commits crimes to protest against her position. But a woman of the intelligentsia, whose relationship with life is more conscious, seeks to clarify the reasons of women's cruel fate. 81. Do the progressives really imagine that working-class women are just simple, ignorant women, for whose rights the braver bourgeois feminists must go to bat? Do they really believe that they are doing working-class women a favor by bringing them into the bourgeois feminist movement? Fortunately, there is no need to worry about the corrupting influence of the progressives on women workers. As much as they talk about the benefits of uniting all women, the progressives take no practical steps towards proletarian women. To date, the Women's Progressive Party has not made a single attempt to disseminate feminist ideas amongst working-class or peasant women as the Alliance has done. Whether the progressives feel that it will be difficult to win over the hearts of women workers with the modest aspirations of their program, or their overly pronounced class spirit prevents them accepting plebeian women into their ranks as equals, the fact is in any case that the progressives only stand for organizing all women on paper. In practice, they are at great pains to defend their party against intrusion by overly democratic female elements. It is their loss, and working-class women's gain. There is one more feminist organization that, despite lacking a defined political program, has in fact been participating actively in the struggle for women's political equality in recent years. That organization is the Russian Women's Mutual Philanthropic Society. Despite the fact that this organization, which is Leda-like through and through, with its select, well-meaning membership, is at great pains to maintain its previous politically neutral position, that it continues to carry out its usual cultural and philanthropic work and turns away from broad social objectives, the awakening of political life continuously pulls even this purely feminist society into its orbit and, one way or another, requires it to react to the political events that are taking place. The WMPS has had occasion to submit petitions, distribute appeals and greetings, express disapproval, and gather information. And, here, too, this has led the more lively and active elements of the society to come together around a women's suffrage department, where, no longer dismissing political and social life, they carry out the usual feminist work around the slogan of political equality for women. The convocation of the All-Russia Women's Congress is as much the work of the WMPS, or, more accurately, their suffrage department, as it is that of the Alliance for Women's Equality. But where do the political sympathies of this first purely feminist organization in Russia lie? Is there any doubt that the society's political convictions side with moderate liberalism, and that they, like the progressives, find the cadets occasionally far too red? Although the society submitted their petition to the First State Duma through the cadet faction, this was, of course, not due to any particular sympathy towards the Party of People's Freedom, but merely because, of all the parties whose programs mentioned women's equality, they were the most right-wing. The society's petition was, of course, phrased in the vaguest, most general terms possible, deploring the fact that, amongst the first representatives of the Russian people, there is not a single woman, nor a single representative elected directly by women. The petition proposes to submit for decision by the State Duma the question of political equality for women in Russia and bring renewal to the lives of women by granting them equal rights to participate in serving their country. In this way, the WMPS evaded every pitfall in defining their political demands. There was no concern of a split within the harmonious society with their clearly defined bourgeois character. The vague phrasing of their aspirations was necessary for the benefit of women outside the society, for those who signed the petition. The more general and unspecified the aspirations of the society, the more reliably the names of women of different political stripes could be collected on the petition. In the same way, the WMPS took care not to make their demands clear or emphasize their political sympathies in the declaration submitted to the Second State Duma through Speaker F. Golovin on the need to grant women equal political rights with men. 82. Only in the 1907 report of the Suffrage Department of the WMPS do we manage to find a clear, unambiguous definition of the society's fundamental political objectives and demands. The objective of the department must be to unite women in one platform, equal voting rights to men. This permits only one conclusion: in any case, the women's society's political demands are on the same level as those of international feminism. Could one expect any more from an organization with such a pronounced Leda-like character? If there could remain any doubt at all about the political radicalism of the women's society, the attitude of this first Russian feminist organization towards the Oktoberist bill on Zemstvo, self-government, should have dispelled all remaining illusions. The principle of property qualifications does not perturb our women's equality pioneers. They appear to have arrived at the idea of property qualified representation of the female element in local self-government on their own. At least, the declaration on the need for equal participation for women in Zemstvo and city government that they submitted to the Second State Duma says nothing about the principles on which this equality is to be based, nor is any mention made of the desirability of simultaneously democratizing the Zemstva themselves. To the contrary, we reiterate that the semi-philanthropic society makes no claim to be politically radical, and shows even less concern about attracting working-class women to their ranks than the Progressive Party. Under the influence of political events and the pressure of the changing societal atmosphere, the character and appearance of our feminist organizations in Russia are also changing. The Radical Alliance for Women's Equality, which had gravitated towards socialism and the revolutionary parties in its younger days, is rapidly fading and moving right, whilst the virtuous WMPs, which had long shied away from all things political, is gradually developing a taste for political actions and beginning to show a previously uncharacteristic degree of activity. And only the Women's Progressive Party, which continues to vacillate between cadettism and Octobrism, continues to lead a quite pitiful and inconspicuous existence. Which of these organizations can proletarian women rely on? In which of them will they find actual supporters and defenders of their interests? Is it not obvious that none of the aforementioned bourgeois women's organizations is capable of responding to the essential demands of women workers, that proletarian women can expect nothing from the bourgeois champions of equality, no matter how radical their political demands may be? Working together with them promises women of the working class nothing but bitterness and disappointment. The feminist movement in Russia is taking on more and more bourgeois coloration. Not only is it not connected to the broader labor movement, but it takes a more and more diametrically antagonistic stance towards it. Although the left wing of feminism, the Alliance for Women's Equality, does continue to champion democratic demands, their diligent dissociation from the class party of the workers is a testament to the fact that the spring of feminism is past, that the romantic illusions have died out, that the bourgeois women's movement no longer even finds it necessary to hide its true class nature. But, since the feminists themselves no longer wish to cooperate with the Workers' Party, they must naturally seek support elsewhere. In itself, the feminist movement is still too weak to rely exclusively on its own forces. It is entirely normal and logical to seek this support from their kindred spirits in the bourgeois parties. The only question is, how reliable are the representatives of bourgeois liberalism as allies to women? To what extent can their mediation promise real political benefits? How proudly the feminists list even the slightest symptoms of sympathy with women's cause on the part of the bourgeois opposition. What outsized significance they assign to the declarations of principle that the liberal bourgeoisie gave out so generously during the revolutionary period. Of course, the greatest number of these declarations that, in one way or another, proclaim the principle of equality for women, date back to the mutinous year of 1905. In this period of heightened political activity, under the pressure of the waves of the people's movement that inexorably moved towards them, the bourgeois opposition learned to speak the people's language. Were there any democratic principles they would have refused to write on their banners? Was there any political demand taken up by the masses that they would have decided to reject? In that memorable year, women were part of the aroused popular masses, they were ubiquitous in the ranks of the workers' and peasants' movements, their voices were constantly heard in nearly all opposition organizations. Failing to take women's demands into account meant going halfway, risking the loss of what was the most essential thing in that critical moment, popularity and the trust of the masses. Over the entire length of 1905, the organs of local government, those nests of opposition, sometimes on their own initiative, other times in response to demands submitted to them by women's groups, adopted resolutions in which they pronounced themselves in favor of equal rights for women and men, some in all areas of state and social life, others only in the organs of local government. A number of provincial and district zemstva that had spoken out in favor of fundamental reforms in the area of the organization of the state and local government at their meetings also proclaimed their support for the principle of women's equality, the zemstvo. Assemblies of the provinces of Tavriisk, Simbirsk, and Kostromsk came out in favor of full equality of rights for the sexes, the Nizhny Novgorod provincial zemstvo supported equal participation for women and men in small local government units. The district zemstva of St. Petersburg, Yuryevets, Temnikovsk, and Balakinsk spoke in favor of granting women passive and active suffrage in reformed city and zemstvo governments, those of Vyatka, Kremenkuk, Gorodninsk, Elizavetgrad, Simferopol, Ardatov, Dmitrovsk, Kologriv, and Staritsk favored granting equal voting rights with men to the female population in all legislative and local government institutions. The city councils of Kronstadt, Voronezh, Kovno, Libava, Vyatka, Kutaisi, Kursk, Stavropol, Tbilisi, Yerevan, Novgorod, and Kostroma called for the extension of the franchise in local government to women. City representatives spoke in the same spirit at the district congresses of Tver and Kostroma. As comforting as these facts may be, we should recall that, even in that heated political moment, resolutions favorable to women were usually only adopted after passionate debates, that proposals to grant suffrage to women always met with outraged objections, and, in many cases, passed by only 1 or 2 votes, and that, ultimately, a number of cities and zemstva categorically refused to accept political equality for women. There are individual cases in which equal rights for women and men were recognized, based on property qualifications. Thus, for example, the Novorossiysk Provincial Assembly on reforming zemstvo institutions resolved to grant suffrage in local zemstva for all payers of zemstvo taxes, for all persons of both sexes who had completed higher or secondary education, and for representatives of the professions, to the exclusion of laborers, a term that is notoriously elastic. The Chernihiv Council recognized that all inhabitants of the city who had reached the age of 25 and been registered there continuously for 2 years should be granted the right to participate in local government. Nor should we forget that all of these resolutions were, more than anything, purely Platonic in character. Those who drafted them knew perfectly well that they were nowhere near being implemented. The demands raised were phrased in the broadest possible terms, as extreme as possible, so as to have room for negotiation. And, if the representatives of local government, despite this, were so reluctant to proclaim the as yet abstract principle of women's equality as one of their desiderata, even in the revolutionary year of 1905, what would have happened had this democratic demand actually been practically implemented? Surely, the feminists do not seriously believe that the representatives of the liberal bourgeoisie would actually have defended this aspiration in principle in practice. The attitude of the congresses of city and zemstvo figures on the subject of women's equality is characteristic. Despite the fact that women's organizations submitted 17 declarations demanding the recognition of women's suffrage to the Polish Congress of City and Zemstvo figures, the local government representatives refused to consider the matter. This was repeated at the next Congress of City and Zemstvo figures in September 1905. This time, too, motions were submitted by women proposing that the Congress speak out in favor of full rights for women. F.A. Golovin explained that the Congress did not wish to consider this matter because at the previous, Polish, Congress, it had been decided to discuss it preliminarily at the local level. At the same time, no responses had yet been received from local government institutions. V.D. Nabokov offered a different reason for the Congress's refusal to examine the matter of women's political rights. In his view, this important matter could only be decided by a future legislature elected on the basis of universal suffrage. By a majority of 72 votes to 63, the Congress declined to discuss the motions of the women's organizations. However, in November, when the wave of revolution had carried off even the most cautious and conservative elements of the opposition, the Congress office adopted the following resolution whilst drafting the basis for the convocation of the Constituent Assembly: Russian citizens of both sexes having attained the age of 21 shall have the right to participate in elected representation. 83. In just the same way, the inclusion of political equality for women in the draft plan of organization of the legislature drawn up at a private meeting of city government figures in Moscow can hardly be considered the enormous triumphant step our equality campaigners present it as. It suffices to recall the vacillations and energetic protests occasioned by the adoption of this point. 84. Characteristic is the survey conducted by the Alliance for Women's Equality not long before the September Congress of Zemstvo and municipal figures on the question of women's suffrage. 35 of them responded more or less sympathetically, 22 were not opposed in principle to equality, but found it untimely, inapposite, etc. to address the issue, and 4 categorically rejected the need for women's equality. This survey, which painted a picture that was by no means comforting, is nonetheless counted by the equality campaigners amongst the indicators that Russian liberalism is sympathetic to the cause of political emancipation for women. In their desire to find something that confirms the sympathy on the part of bourgeois liberals, the equality campaigners are even willing to distort the recent past. The answers were written. The pamphlet Jenskoy Dvijhini states, "At a very turbulent moment of our troubled time, the crushing misery of the people and the cruel oppression of the social movement led to the Manifesto of August 6, 1905 on the State Duma, an advisory body with no legislative significance, maintaining in their previous force all bans and restrictions imposed by the police, the censors, and others on meetings, individual liberties, and freedom of expression." The manifesto encountered dismal indifference across the country. It was as if the population had conspired not to implement its provisions, but to go forward on their own path, though it was not clear what path that might be. The alliance's questions propose a fundamental rupture in the state and social order. It was not easy for people of moderate views to give reasoned answers, nor could figures of more radical tendencies answer with their previous courage. The parliament was forming one way or another, and the attitudes and speeches of visible figures were becoming more responsible. Perhaps this is why many declined to respond to the survey. 85. Do our feminists seriously believe that the period of August 6 to October 17, 1905 was a period of reduced demands, in which people of moderate views were afraid to break with the foundations of the state, and the radicals were no longer able to answer the questions posed with their former courage? Fortunately, the days of September and October 1905 are still well remembered by all, and there is no chance of finding witnesses willing to testify that that was a time of reduced intensity in society. Of course not. It was not fear of breaking with the very foundations of the state that led the liberal bourgeoisie to view the matter of women's political equality with indifference, but the hostility inherent in that class, which only disappeared when, with the aid of precautionary measures in the form of the requirement of a property qualification, it became possible to transform the demanded reform into a means of tightening the bourgeoisie's grip on power. The supposed gravitation of bourgeois liberals to the practical defense of women's equality, even in the revolutionary year of 1905, is dubious in the extreme. Of course, in the bourgeois democratic organizations, in all the unions of the intelligentsia that rapidly multiplied in 1905, political equality for women met with much greater sympathy, and found its way into programs with much less friction. The Union of Engineers, Teachers, the Union of Physicians, and other organizations that brought together the members of the liberal professions, not to mention those that were proletarian in character, unions like those of the railway and postal and telegraph workers, adopted this demand together with other democratic points in their programs. However, it must be noted that, at the Congress of Writers and Journalists in March 1905, when adopting a detailed electoral formula, the words "without distinction as to sex" were not included without struggle, and that only at the insistence of the socialist parties. Nor did this demand make it into the platforms of the Academics' Union or that of the Constitutionalist Zemstvo members. The Alliance of Alliances itself initially took an utterly ambiguous position on this matter. Despite the fact that women closely followed the appearance of every new political alliance and, every time political equality for women was not included in the draft platform of an alliance, they went to the alliance to call for the insertion of the words of both sexes in the 4-member formula of the Constituent Assembly, orally or in writing, stating the reasons for the demands. Despite this, at the organizing assembly of the Alliance of Alliances, these words were by no means included in all platforms of the alliances. 86. The very fact that women showed up in the office of the Congress of the Alliance of Alliances in spring 1905 was met with frank astonishment. Why are there women here? There must be some sort of misunderstanding. But the women calmly and firmly took their positions, and people quickly got accustomed to their presence. the equality campaigners themselves report. Of 14 alliances that came together, barely 4 included the 7-member formula with equal rights for both sexes in their platforms. However, women's participation in congresses of delegates had a positive influence on the other alliances. Representatives of the extreme parties, who supported agitation for women's equality, were active within each of them in order to give the platform a clearly democratic character. Relying on the extreme parties, women were able to introduce amendments into all platforms. 87. However, initially, women's chances were so poor that it was not even decided to bring a detailed formula for the Constituent Assembly in the platform of the Alliance of Alliances to a vote. Instead, they agitated against it, wishing to silence the female question and have time to agitate in the interests of their own rights amongst the intelligentsia. This was entirely successful. Every time a resolution of the A of A was drafted, even allies inevitably forgot about women, and the women persistently demanded to be mentioned in the appropriate part of the resolution. The very first time, 2 months after the organizing assembly, the majority came out in favor of including women. With every resolution, this majority grew, and, at the St. Petersburg Congress in July, women achieved a total victory in the A of A. When it came to a vote, mentions of women were included in the resolution with only 1 vote against, that of P.N. Milyukov. Subsequently, we demanded detailed specification of the formula for the Constituent Assembly in the A of A platform, and that was done. 88. If including a demand for equal political rights for women and men in the programs of even democratic organizations met with such difficulties in that revolutionary period, what could women expect from bourgeois democrats in a period of political calm and reduced intensity in society? Not much need be said of the cadets' attitude towards the question of political equality for women, the facts are all too well known. 89. At the October Congress, this question was met with an extremely unfriendly reception. The visible cadet leaders, chief amongst them Milyukov and Struve, expressed their totally negative view of this utopian demand. For lack of arguments, Struve tried to rely on Muslim women and the danger of complications that might arise from this. Judge for yourself whether it would be just for Russian women to gain access to the ballot box at the same time as a Muslim woman living on the same land, governed by the same laws, remains disenfranchised because Sharia prohibits them dealing with public affairs. After turbulent debates, the majority of the Congress accepted the demand for political equality for women, but out of respect for the prominent members of the party who were in the minority, the Congress permitted a footnote on the party program declaring that the point concerning political equality for women was not binding on party members. Keep in mind that these debates took place in October 1905. To be sure, at the next Cadet Congress, this footnote was removed, but we must remember under what circumstances this second Congress took place. That was on the eve of the First Duma, the heated pre-election period, a time when the Cadet Party was at the apex of its popularity and political influence. If the cadets had left that footnote in effect at that decisive political moment, they would have shown themselves simply to be bad politicians. However, our equality campaigners' object, the defense of women's equality, was by no means bait put out by the cadets to win the hearts of naive democratic voters, a decorative principle that they would lightly forget when standing at the lectern in front of the people's representatives. When it came to the actual defense of women's interests in the First Duma, the cadets beautifully fulfilled the obligations they had assumed. Let us tarry a bit more on this important event in the history of the women's movement, the recognition of political equality for women by the first elected Russian popular representatives. When the feminists speak with affection and joy of the sessions of 2 and May 4 and 5, 6, and June 8, 1906, they normally highlight the chivalrous behavior of Professor Petrashitsky, Karyaev, Lomshakov, and the other cadets, only mentioning the defense of women's equality from a more democratic group of representatives, i.e., the Trudoviks, in passing. Surely it was they who first raised their voice in favor of including the words without distinction as to sex in the formula for electoral law in the address in response to the speech from the throne. We are saying that electoral law must be reformed on the basis of a four-member formula. We are forgetting in this first Russian parliament about Russian women, who, side by side with the others, fought for freedom. We are forgetting that the son of a slave woman cannot be a citizen. Thus spoke the Trudovik Rizhkov. He was supported by Trudoviks Bondarev, Buslov, Onipko, and Zabolotny. Following the Trudoviks, the floor was granted to the cadet Lomshakov. The emancipation of the peasants, he said. The emancipation of the working class, the emancipation of all citizens, the emancipation of women, that is the first objective of our work. And here, as in all other matters, for us, there can and will be no retreat. An accidental slip of the tongue by one of our comrades here, for I believe it to be a slip of the tongue, directed not to us, but to those present who do not agree with our program on the matter of women's equality. For us, women are equal in rights to men, equal not only in political rights, but in civil rights, completely equal with no exceptions. However, the speech did not meet with any enthusiasm on the part of his party comrades. A typical representative of the cadets, the slim, cautious Nabokov, explained to the Duma that the commission that had drafted the reply address had decided not to go into detail on the electoral formula for the very reason that this issue had given rise to disagreements within the commission itself and that it would be more cautious to keep it to general terms. On the matter of universal suffrage, we had a majority and a minority. The minority were in favor of disclosing this formula, and for introducing universal suffrage as it is understood by those who stand for universal, direct, secret, and equal voting rights without distinction of sex, nationality, and religion. The majority believed that we would be acting with greater circumspection and caution if we were to leave the formula we have introduced, which best reflects the actually expressed will of the people, but, if we introduce any sort of additional specifications, we not only cannot state with certainty that it is the one will of the entire people, but even risk failing to achieve unanimity within the Duma as such. The majority kept the term universal suffrage. On the matter of sex, the Commission believed that, at the point in the address that concerns equality of nationalities and religions, the word sex, which had been omitted by accident, should of course be added. This somewhat belated correction concerns another part of the reply address, concerning the drafting of a law granting equality of rights to all citizens, with the abolition of all restrictions and privileges based on class, nationality, and religion. The failure to include the words and sex in this section is, in any case, entirely typical. It shows that women can hardly feel reassured about their fate upon placing the defense of their interests in the hands of enlightened liberals. However, it is not one of the cadet representatives, but once again the Trudovik Anakin who objects to Nabokov's statement on the first point concerning political rights for women. Likewise, they say that it would not be a unanimous expression of the will of the people if we grant equal rights to women, fully one half of our country, fully one half of suffering mothers who carried us in arms as children. As if women cannot submit their ballot or their electoral note, as if they for some reason were incapable of that. In a free country, all are free, and even the rapporteur on the draft said that, in the part of the address concerning civil rights, women were omitted by accident. Where they were omitted accidentally here, they are being omitted deliberately, and that deliberate omission is criminal. I think that their civil rights must be confirmed. By this, Nabokov is already moved to make a more definite statement of the actual stance, if not of all cadets, then of an influential segment of the party, on the matter of political equality for women. I must emphasize that which I already had the honor to discuss. On this matter, we, for example, who belong to the People's Freedom Party, did not bargain off our convictions, and spoke of the formula that, in our view, unites the whole people and can be adopted. The previous speaker may be correct. For us, i.e., the majority, we are not fully and definitely convinced of it. We would not dare to state that the unanimous will of the people demands political equality for women, and we did not speak of any such unanimous popular will. If we are wrong about that, then that is the only thing we are wrong about. He is supported by Prince Shakovskoy. Shakovskoy, too, defends the Commission's draft, deeming it necessary to postpone a decision on the matter of direct elections and women's rights until such time as the corresponding law is being drafted. The Duma, in his view, only had to adopt a resolution on these two matters after they had been fully and robustly clarified. Frankel took the side of the cautious cadets against Lomshakov and Protopopov, and spoke in favor of extending the franchise to the female portion of the population, and denied that it was necessary to disclose an electoral formula. He based his view on the fact that, within the confines of this very commission, a sufficient number of persons on the right, albeit the minority, took the view that it was not necessary to grant suffrage to women at this particular moment, and that, in order for us to be entitled to speak of the unanimous demands of the country, we needed to find complete unanimity in the ranks of our commission. After all, we cannot judge these matters as lightly as they are being judged here. Thus, even on the very first day of the existence of the representative body, with its unparalleled significance, in that triumphant moment full of expectations and hope, our esteemed cadets still could not make up their minds to stand openly on the side of democratic demands. They did not have enough courage to claim that the people wished to send their directly elected representatives to the Duma in order to double the number of their voters in the interests of a democratic Russia by extending the franchise to women. In a touching show of unity, the independent peasant Kruglikov and the Octoberist Count Hayden stood with the cautious cadets. "Honorable representatives," said Kruglikov, "when they sent us here, quite a few peasants did not even know about universal suffrage without distinction as to sex. Our women are not interested in universal suffrage, our women are there to look after the household, to look after the children and the hearth." Count Hayden, of course, argued in more refined terms, but, in essence, totally agreed with the view of the peasant Kruglikov. "I have a mandate from my countrymen to state that they do not share the opinion of Mr. Zabolotny that they cannot live without universal suffrage in direct, equal, and secret elections. They find that they can live with universal suffrage, and life experience shows that it is not absolutely necessary to extend equal rights to women as well. Initially, we must first get accustomed to parliamentary activity in the composition to which we are already accustomed, i.e., with an assembly consisting only of men. As is known, when the amendment calling for the disclosure of the electoral formula came to a vote, it was rejected by the majority. The same fate was met by the amendment calling for the inclusion of the words without distinction as to sex. As for another point of the reply address that called for all citizens to be equal before the law, the amendment introduced into the text by the Commission themselves, including the words without distinction as to sex, was adopted following minor debates. However, this time, too, it was not a representative of the People's Freedom Party, but the worker Mikhail Lyshenko, who stood in defense of this amendment during the plenary session. A careful examination of the course of the debates in the Duma during the drafting of the reply address shows that, contrary to the assertions of the feminists, the impression left by the defense of women's equality by the cadets is by no means favorable. No, in those first days of the First Duma, the cadets did not show themselves to be reliable defenders of women's interests. But nonetheless, the feminists will object, rushing to the defense of the cadets. The Party of People's Freedom did an excellent job justifying women's hopes during the memorable Women's Days on 5, 6, and June 8. A proposed constitution establishing civil equality was introduced by members of the Duma. The fourth series of laws included the principle that restrictions provided for persons of the female sex by the civil laws, restrictions on receiving education at all levels, restrictions on active and passive suffrage, and, in general, restrictions on public rights, to the extent not impeded by the essence of the duties associated with those rights, shall be abolished. This time, the Cadet Party presented a series of orators who defended the principle of equal rights for the female population: Kokoshin, Professor Kiryaev, Professor Petrashitsky, all impressive names. In a detailed speech, Professor Petrashitsky, to whom the women's petition drafted by the Women's Society had been submitted, demanded equality of rights for women in all areas of social and political life. I have been given a mandate addressed to the State Duma, the professor said. In relation to our memorandum, I am in receipt of a petition seeking equal rights for women from the Russian Women's Mutual Philanthropic Society addressed to Deputy Kendran and myself, bearing more than 4,000 signatures, and I have been given the mandate to make this known to the Duma. Alas, the right of petition is not yet recognized in our country, and under the rules currently in force, I am deprived of the possibility of carrying out the mandate given to me by the Women's Society. However, I consider it my duty to provide at least some small support to the satisfaction of the just desires of thousands of petitioners and say a few words from this platform in the interest of abolishing the disenfranchisement of women. This is all the more a duty of conscience given that, unfortunately, the female question arouses nowhere near as much interest and sympathy as it deserves. In demanding equal rights for women in the area of civil legal relations, mainly in inheritance rights, demanding access for women to all levels of education, all occupations and professions, a defender of women's equality must naturally also address the question of women's participation in the legislature and local government institutions. Here, however, the esteemed professor with his cadet spirit involuntarily lost his nerve and hastened to justify himself to his party comrades, who did not share his passion for women's rights. The main, and apparently most radical, point of our program, is that of granting women suffrage in the area of local government and the legislature. This point is such that, given how widespread prejudices are, defending it means sacrificing one's reputation as a serious politician and even subjecting oneself to ridicule. As such, I consider it all the more a duty of conscience to say here that the interests of the state, society, and culture demand that we take this last, greatest step, granting suffrage to women. The poor deputies of the socialist parties. How many times have they had occasion, in such cases, to risk their reputation as serious politicians by standing in defense of women's interests? But Professor Petrashitsky, of course, mostly had other members of his party in mind. It is in their eyes that he was risking his reputation as a serious politician. In order to save himself from accusations of being utopian and unserious, he even had to call upon the aid of John Stuart Mill. As a predecessor in the defense of this point, I am proud to be able to point to the great thinker John Stuart Mill, who, already in the middle of the last century, took the view that women should be granted suffrage. The representative of the Party of People's Freedom took his self-sacrifice in defense of women's equality to such an extent that he decided to go farther than Mill himself. But I will go further than John Stuart Mill. I find it desirable for women to be involved in politics, and that, the greater their involvement, the better for the state, society, and progress. This proposition may seem strange and paradoxical to you. I note some ironic smiles, but I hope that, upon hearing my explanations, you will acknowledge that it is at least worthy of consideration. What is politics, and what does it mean to be engaged in politics? Engaging in politics means concerning oneself with the general welfare. Taking an interest in politics means taking an interest not in one's own narrow, selfish interests, but the interests of the general welfare. Petrashitsky concluded his speech with the words, "The interests of the general welfare and the culture demand that we grant women political, i.e., social, rights and duties." Despite the beautiful form of this speech, the esteemed professor's argument hardly sounded convincing. He built his case for recognizing women's equality on the usual ideological foundation of bourgeois liberalism, elevating the culture, the principle of the general welfare, the principles of justice, humanity, etc. Not a word about the growing significance of women's labor in the economic lives of peoples, not a word about the political significance that the extension of the franchise to women would have for democracy. Most characteristic of all, however, is the fact that, in defending the principle of equality for women, the esteemed professor hastened first to calm public opinion with the caveat that the propositions he put forward were still far from establishing real equality of the sexes. In fact, If our propositions on women's participation in administration, on the civil service, participation in the legislature, etc., become law, it would be naive to think that such laws would result in actual equality for women in the area of administration, the legislature, etc. Old prejudices, the selfish interests of the representatives of the privileged sex, and other obstacles, particularly initially, will prevent not only actual equality and justice, but even any movement in that direction, for a long time yet. Only a relatively small number of women, only those who are especially and extremely sensible and outstanding, indeed, more sensible and outstanding than the men competing with them as candidates for the office of deputies, administrators, etc., will actually attain those rights. In other words, don't be afraid to recognize women's equality. In principle. Dear comrades, in practical reality, this aspiration is still far from being realized. Obviously, such a refrain was necessary in order to incline the cadet majority of the First Duma in favor of women's equality. The diplomatic note that was sounded each time by the cadets' orators when the subject of women's equality came up showed that, although the overall mood of the country and the cadets' efforts to maintain their popularity forced them to express sympathy to women's democratic demands, on the other hand, the responsible position of the party, from which they conducted negotiations about establishing a cadet ministry, required them to remain within the confines of caution and realpolitik. This duplicitous situation also led to the ambiguous position adopted by the cadets on the matter of women's equality. The cadets were unable to highlight their progressiveness on this issue even at the expense of the right-wing opponents of women's equality. The right, in the person of Count Hayden, did not so much dispute the principle itself as raise the complexities and difficulties of putting it into practice. These rights, said Hayden, are also extremely complex given their attendant effects on family law. Currently, the wife follows the husband, consequently, if the wife leaves her husband, the family, under our laws, is grouped around the husband. If wives are given equality in rights to husbands, it will be necessarily immediately to draft a law on the dissolution of spousal cohabitation, to draft a law on the parent to whom the children of separated spouses will go. Nothing can be done about this with the stroke of a pen. It is necessary to delve into the most diffuse properties, the properties of peasant life, where, for example, in the area of land ownership, by custom, the daughter does not inherit from the father if there are living brothers. Consequently, the entire communal structure is built on units of the male sex. Once women have equality, of course, they must also have rights in the community and rights to peasant property. As such, this brings up truly expansive issues that are by no means so easy to address. Hayden was seconded by Professor Kovalevsky. Equal rights within the state also impose equal duties upon citizens. As such, discussing the matter of political equality for women immediately raises the issue of whether to extend to compulsory military service to women. Shall we form a corps of Amazons, or not? In all probability, no one is planning to form a corps of Amazons. In this regard, it will be necessary to make the same amendment the English have made since the days of Elizabeth and the first codifiers of the common law, including Judge Coke. The English express this with the famous aphorism, Parliament can do anything, but it cannot turn a man into a woman and a woman into a man. Lastly, the third to stand in opposition to women's equality was the peasant Kruglikov. However, his argument mostly amounted to sayings taken from the Holy Scriptures: wives submit to their husbands, Eve was made by the Lord as a helper for Adam, but not with equal rights, etc. If we give equal rights to peasant women, what will come of it? What are peasant men to do then? Are women to be sent to town meetings? Are they also meant to be sent to the fields and conscripted as soldiers? And the men are meant to stay home? Asked Kruglikov. However, Kruglikov was such a nothing opponent and expressed so little of the actual mood amongst the peasantry at that historic moment that he was completely unable to get the cadets to engage with him. It is in general noteworthy that not a single clear defender or spokesman for women's disenfranchisement could be found at the First Duma. The same societal mood that took shape beyond the walls of the Duma and forced the majority of the Duma, to their own surprise, to propose and defend radical, almost socialist reforms, also pushed the Duma farther to the left than they themselves wanted to go on the matter of women's equality. In this case, the cadets merely swam with the overall current, instead of finding themselves in the role of glorious, but solitary, fighters for democratic principles, including women's equality. They merely had to second the voices raised from the leftist benches. The liberal bourgeoisie waited in vain for the demand for women's equality to meet with opposition from the peasantry, whose inertia, ignorance, and conservatism would have seemed to guarantee it. These unfounded expectations were dashed by reality. The most passionate, energetic, and, above all, sincere defenders of women's equality in the Duma turned out to be none other than the representatives of the peasantry, the Trudovics. Though the arguments of these defenders of women's equality, too, occasionally stumbled, though the Trudovics, following in the footsteps of bourgeois liberalism, bolstered their conclusions with references to natural law, justice, and the people's welfare. A great force made its presence felt behind these external deficiencies. The unvarnished voice of life itself was speaking with the voices of the Trudovics. For the Trudovics, the defense of women's equality was not merely a duty imposed by a political petition, but a direct, living demand of an entire stratum of the population, a demand to which the latter's class interests were most intimately linked. The total victory of democratic principles over the old feudal system was the conditio sine qua non of the continued existence of the peasantry. As long as class privilege remained in force, as long as even one part of the peasantry remained burdened by any legal restrictions, the people cannot breathe truly freely and stand up straight after becoming accustomed to hunch over to carry gentlemen on their backs. The nobility, that part of humanity that is provided with full rights and holds all privileges, was completely opposed by the peasantry, including peasant women. Even allowing that the political consciousness of the peasantry had only just formed, and that the words class struggle had reached the ears of their representatives for the first time in the halls of the State Duma, in some subconscious region, the idea took shape that a peasant woman might be just a baba. But she was nonetheless closer to a peasant man than those alien, and even hostile, representatives of the bourgeoisie and the aristocracy. Class instinct quite correctly caused them to see the extension of rights even to peasant women a sort of safeguard against the hegemony of the other estates. It was necessary to insist on rights not passing by their siblings, peasant women. This view of the peasantry was expressed in particular detail at the congresses of the peasant unions. As early as the founding Congress in July 1905, peasant deputies stated that given that we peasants, upon acquiring land, do not exclude women from its use, it would be inconsistent of us to deprive them of political rights. This is particularly important in those areas where the male population engages in seasonal work out of town and only the women remain at home. 90. In support of his views, one of the peasants present stated that, having attained suffrage for women, as well, the peasantry can rely on this to create a second army in defense of peasant interests. At the same time, the Congress adopted a unanimous resolution in favor of granting women active suffrage in all representative institutions, and the majority of votes were cast in favor of passive suffrage. A number of resolutions adopted at peasant meetings confirms that, for peasant men, the matter of political equality for women was closely merged with the expansion of their own rights and was treated by them not from the point of view of abstract justice and other lofty ideological categories but was prompted by the practical considerations of life. This explains why the peasant representatives' speeches in the First Duma were also more sincere and convincing than all the superficial eloquence of the cadets' performances. However, do the conduct of the Trudovic group in the First Duma and the peasantry's defense of women's rights during 1905 give us cause to count the peasantry amongst the consistent defenders of women's equality? In highlighting the Trudovics' contributions to the cause of women, we must once again take into account the societal atmosphere that dictated the political positions of the first people's representatives. To reiterate, in calling for the civil and political emancipation of women, the peasant representatives merely sought to bring about the most complete and irreversible solution to their own disenfranchisement. That was a moment in which the interests of the old and new Russia clashed acutely, a moment in which it seemed that only a fundamental break with the previous foundations would be able to put an end to the hated remnants of the feudal bureaucratic system, and the more fundamental this break, the more reliable the victory of the new Russia would be. Since then, much has changed, not only in the societal atmosphere surrounding us, but in the psychology of the peasantry themselves. The questions are no longer posed as barely and acutely, though democratic demands have not lost their force and urgency, they are losing the heightened idealistic character they had been given by the revolutionary mood of the masses. Doubtlessly, a certain sobriety has taken hold amongst the peasantry. The face of the Trudovics of the Second Duma was already totally different to those of the first, and it was totally in vain that the equality campaigners submitted their petition to the Duma through them. Women cannot count on the peasants to be reliable allies. Is it not typical that the peasantry defended women's rights and interests even in the revolutionary period only inasmuch as these rights and interests were contrary to the rights of the privileged classes of Russia? The peasantry demanded equal political rights for women, equal land rights for peasant women, but, when the matter of equality for women within the confines of mutual relations amongst peasants was raised, equality rarely found sympathy. This was the case in peasant discussions of the matter of equal inheritance rights, voting rights for women at town meetings, etc. When a new societal wave once again brings matters of democratic representation to the political foreground, the peasantry may raise their voices in defense of Baba interests, but it is also possible that they will decline to do so. The moment in which the interests of a democratic Russia that had taken its first steps on the path of open political struggle openly and acutely conflicted with the old class system, feudalism, and the gentry cannot be repeated, because, despite all the celebrations amongst reactionaries, the old, pre-revolutionary Russia no longer exists. When political life flows by peacefully, without any dramatic, open collisions between old and new Russia, the matter of women's equality naturally takes on the appearance of an abstract principle that is not directly connected to the immediate objectives of the peasantry, and, as such, is not capable of eliciting any particular sympathy or enthusiasm amongst them. To the contrary, the equality campaigners themselves are also rather cooling off towards the peasantry. They are now transferring all their hopes over to the cadet party, whose spirit is much more familiar to them. And though, in the past, this party had more than once given cause to doubt their dedication to the cause of women, shared class interests naturally pushed our equality campaigners into the cadets' embrace. Perhaps the example of their Western European comrades has convinced them that the bourgeois prejudice against women's emancipation falls away as feminists turn away from the nets of the socialists and work together increasingly closely with the liberals. Bourgeois women, like proletarian women, are inevitably winning access to one occupation after another, taking their places side by side with the men of their class, and, having become a social force, they must be reckoned with one way or another based on pure class considerations. To ignore their demands and aspirations would mean harming their own class interests, pushing one of their own into the ranks of the opposition, thus weakening and splitting the bourgeoisie's own forces. Under the onslaught of democratic demands from the working class, on the one hand, and under pressure from the bourgeois women's movement, on the other, the bourgeoisie are forced to give serious consideration to the question of what role in politics women can be given so as to ensure that they close ranks with their fellow members of the bourgeoisie and defend their shared class interests together with them. One such means of rendering harmless the women's movement is that of including women in political life, but with a specified property qualification. By this means, it is possible, contrary to the proverb, to kill two hares at once, in the first place, increasing the representation of the propertied classes, in the second, to return oppositionally inclined female elements to the bosom of their own, bourgeois, Class. If bourgeois women are granted the opportunity to freely cast their own votes, they will of course use them to increase the political power of their own class, and, of course, cease to support even occasionally the enemies of property and order in the interests of their female ideals. Property qualified suffrage for women, Clara Zetkin notes in this regard, absolutely does not eliminate the political disenfranchisement of the entire female sex, but is instead a means to increase the power of the propertied classes, protecting the totality of the political and social enslavement of the exploited masses. It comes as no surprise that, reactionaries of various stripes are glowing with sympathy for property-qualified women's suffrage in all countries. Their reliable instincts tell them that, given its significance in the class struggle of labor against capital, this is not a progressive measure, but a reactionary one. 91. Zetkin's accurate view of the significance and role of property-qualified representation for women is constantly confirmed by everyday life. One need not go far to find examples. On January 28, 1908, none other than Zemstvo, electoral law reform bill that would extend active suffrage to PHE Octobrists, those principled opponents of women's equality, introduced in the State Duma a property-qualified members of the female population. Section 10 of the bill rules for the selection of district and provincial electors states, the right to participate in electoral assemblies and select electors shall be enjoyed as appropriate by persons who are Russian subjects, if such persons have for no less than 1 year owned real property within the limits of the district on which, during the 3 years prior to the election, district and provincial Zemstvo rates have been paid in an average amount not less than 4 rubles per annum. Further on, 11 of the rules provides that persons of male and female sex enjoy the right to participate in Zemstvo electoral assemblies, but those less than 25 years of age may not participate personally in said assemblies. These sections provide active suffrage for property qualified women. However, the Octobrist bill does not grant women passive suffrage. 13 provides that persons of female sex meeting the requirements set forth in 4 and 10 shall be entitled to participate personally in Zemstvo electoral assemblies, but may not be elected as Zemstvo electors. As if to compensate for this restriction, persons of female sex who, for some reason, are not permitted to participate personally in Zemstvo electoral assemblies are granted the right to grant their male relatives who do not meet the property qualification a proxy to participate in elections, if those persons meet the other requirements set forth for personal participation in Zemstvo elections. Such persons may be elected as Zemstvo electors. Adult electors of both sexes who have not reached the age of 25 are granted the right to delegate their vote to a person meeting the requirements set forth in the rules. Minors are represented by their guardians and trustees. Moreover, female electors who are minors are granted the right to delegate their right to male relatives who do not meet the property qualification. The entire bill is permeated with a clear class spirit. Its objective is to solidify the domination of Zemstva governments by the representatives of the propertied class. Of course, what is proposed is not representation for people, but for property. Both the property qualification provided pursuant to the bill and the preservation of the class-based electoral system based on the amount of property tax paid are a testament to the blatant desire of the Octobrists to concentrate local government in the hands of the representatives of property and, moreover, of large property holdings. Of course, the extension of active suffrage to women does not result from principled considerations, but the totally understandable concern for consolidating representation for the propertied strata of the population. Women are permitted to participate in the election of electors in order to safeguard the homogeneous class interests of a sufficient number of electors who are homogeneous in terms of their property status. Compared to the Ordinance of 1864, the 1890 Ordinance on Zemstvo Institutions narrowed the group of people to whom women could delegate their votes. The percentage of proxies issued by women proved quite small, and that, given the large number of individual female property owners, quite often resulted in the number of Zemstvo electors appearing at assemblies being smaller than the number of electors to be elected. 92. There are two ways to do away with this abnormal situation: either broaden the framework that determines the capacity to participate in Zemstvo government, i.e., grant access to local government institutions to the democratic strata of the population, or keep the property qualification completely intact and grant the previously disenfranchised female element of the propertied classes access to elections. For the Octobrists, it was entirely logical and natural to opt for the latter solution. If the Octobrists had actually intended to allow women to participate in local government, if they had unexpectedly become inflamed with sympathy for the cause of women's equality, they would, of course, not limit themselves to granting active suffrage to women. However, in this case, it was only important to ensure an adequate number of electors of their own class, and that objective was totally met by allowing property qualified women to participate in elections. The supplementary provision of 12 of the bill, according to which minor female electors may delegate their rights to male relatives who do not meet the property qualification, serves to confirm that the living person, the woman, is a mere smokescreen, a means to create an additional property qualified elector. What view do our equality campaigners take on the bill proposed by the Octobrists? Does it meet with sympathy amongst bourgeois women, or does the property qualification it provides, which clearly defends the interests of only the propertied classes, lead at least the radical left wing of the equality campaigners to condemn it? When, already in autumn of 1907, the issue of reforming local government on principles that would grant active suffrage to women who pay Zemstvo rates came up, some members of the Alliance for Women's Equality were entirely sympathetic to the proposal, and, though they complained that such a reform would be incomplete, they did so exclusively on account of the denial of passive suffrage to the female population. 93. However, it turned out that the publishers of Soyuz did not stand in solidarity with that segment of the equality movement, and even added a footnote to an article expressing sympathy with the proposed reform, in which they expressed the opinion that the reform of local government must not be carried out otherwise than on the basis of universal suffrage, both for men and for men. With this footnote, the Soyuz publishers appeared to confirm that they had not changed their prior political foundations and remained true to their democratic banner. The same issue of Soyuz includes an editorial containing a harsh response to the Octobrists who, before the elections to the Third Duma, had called upon Moscow women, property-qualified female citizens, to delegate their votes only in the interests of candidates of the Octobrist party. At the time, although the equality campaigners felt flattered to a certain extent by the Octobrist appeal, they nonetheless resolutely refused to collaborate with them. 94. The equality campaigners also showed no particular sympathy for the small Zemstvo unit reform bill proposed at the Congress of Zemstvo. Figures in August 1907. The proposed reform called for passive suffrage for women, but the equality campaigners grouped around Soyuz were not impressed. Of course, the origins of the magnanimity of these defenders of women's political rights are understandable. The entire local reform bill is based on a narrow property qualification, and its drafters evidently were acting out of a desire to swell the ranks of the electors of their class and, perhaps also, to rely on the female conservatism that opponents of equality are wont to bring up. In any case, on the occasion of the Congress of Landlords, where any somewhat sensible idea got caught up in the impassable thicket of prejudices and caste appetites, even this spark of innovation was, if not a step, then at least a slight movement forward. 95. Expressing certainty that women's interests would meet with little sympathy in the Third Duma, where the Friends of Dubrovin and Purishkevich are given more space than the Octobrists themselves, the equality campaigners once again mention the intimate link between the fate of the opposition and that of women's cause in Russia. Every defeat of the opposition deals a heavy blow to women's interests, whilst every victory hastens the hour of women's victory. As such, it is obvious that, already in November 1907, the Alliance for Women's Equality held fast to the democratic demands that formed the basis of their program and condemned property qualified representation, and even the inclusion of women in the ranks of property qualified electors did not soften their hearts or incline them favorably towards the proposed Zemstvo reforms. But more than 6 months have gone by, and what grey, dismal, and dire months they have been. Reactionaries are holding their heads high in victory. The Third Duma unequivocally and systematically supports reactionaries in their struggle against the reforms that life has brought about. The demands of one opposition group after another are dropped. Is it any surprise that even our equality campaigners have not maintained their previous position on local government reform and the fundamental principles for elections contained therein? However, one caveat is needed. We have seen no direct statements from the left wing of our feminists in the Alliance for Women's Equality indicating a change in their view on property qualifications. We will carefully peruse the literature of the Alliance in an attempt to find a direct answer on their view of the Octobrist bill. Soyuz dedicates a significant amount of space to critiquing and parsing this bill, but all notes and objections are directed not against the main content of the law, the principle of property qualifications, but against the restrictive provisions of the law that deprive women who are Zemstvo ratepayers of passive suffrage. Soyuz also published an entirely well-founded critique of the bill by the Women's Mutual Philanthropic Society, but, here, too, not a single word indicates the publication's own stance. To what extent do Soyuz themselves stand in solidarity with the considerations expressed therein? Do they have no other, weightier arguments against the Octobrist bill? Meanwhile, the Women's Society parses the bill from a purely bourgeois feminist point of view. They reproach the Octobrists for the fact that the new bill restricts women's rights even compared to the 1864 Ordinance on Zemstvo institutions, under which women, until the 1890 reform, were able to delegate their property qualification not only to relatives, but to any man who was property qualified in the respective locality. In the present time, i.e., 44 years after the Zemstvo reform, according to the text of the motion of 30 members of the State Duma, the right of land-holding women to delegate their votes remains limited to close relatives. 96. However, the Women's Society opposes 13 of the bill, which denies property qualified women the right to be elected, more vigorously than anything else. The feminists make an unexpected discovery. One cannot but assume that the extension of women's voting rights is being carried out for purposes that have nothing in common with the interests of women themselves. And, in an effort to accuse the drafters of the bill of insincerity and lack of dedication to women's interests, they state, both the ordinance on Zemstvo institutions and the bill proposed by 30 members of the State Duma define women's voting rights in a manner that blatantly contracts the fundamental principles on which the right to vote is based. They take the foundational principle of elections to be property, not persons, and that point of view fundamentally changes as soon as the subject of women comes up. Then, legislatures are no longer guided by property as the condition for the right to vote, but the person. Many Zemstvo figures had already pointed out this contradiction in the Zemstvo Institutions Ordinance, which violates the idea of justice, back in 1903, when changes to property qualifications were under examination. 97. Obviously, if the Octobrists had granted passive suffrage to women, whilst preserving the property qualification on which the bill was based, the feminists would have considered the matter quite justly resolved, and would have rejoiced at the proposed reforms. This assumption is confirmed by the feminists themselves in the opinion expressed by the Board of the Women's Society on the bill in question. They merely call for the elimination of the restrictions to the rights of women set forth in 13 of the motion by 30 members of the State Duma, whilst completely avoiding the issue of fundamentally changing this bill in relation to women's rights. The feminists do not protest against the property qualification on which Zemstvo election law is based, nor do they mention the undeniable injustice of allocating voices based on class, nor do they even demand a reduction or modification of the property qualification. 98. Does it really come as a surprise to see the right-wing feminists grouped around the WMPS take such a stance on property qualifications? We have already mentioned their prominently expressed ladylike character more than once. But does the Radical Alliance for Women's Equality share this view? What is the meaning of the Alliance's steadfast reluctance to state their view of the Octoberist bill? Does it mean that the footnote added by the Alliance nearly a year ago to Mrs. Bezobrazova's article remains in effect, and that the Alliance remains opposed in principle to property qualifications? Or, on the other hand, does it mean that without changing their principles, the Alliance have managed to change their tactics so radically that they consider it entirely permissible for themselves not only not to struggle actively against a proposal based on property qualifications, but even to decline to criticize the basis of it on the pages of their house organ? By all appearances, even the left wing of our feminists have decided to remain silent on the netlesome question of property qualifications and wait in the wings to see whether the Octoberists pass this law, which is so favorable to bourgeois women, as the first step in a chain of further victories in principle for women. To the contrary, in this case, the Octoberists are not alone, as Soyuzhenshin itself reports. The cadet faction in the Duma, for their part, have decided to make only the following amendments on the subject of women's rights to the bill: to add the words of both sexes after the word persons in 10 and strike 12 and 13 as irrelevant following the inclusion of those words. If the amendment granting passive suffrage to women is voted down in the Commission or the Duma, the Parliamentary Commission of the People's Freedom Party deem it necessary to vote in favor of 12 and 13 in their current version, given that the right of delegation provided by those sections constitutes some completely inadequate compensation for the denial of passive suffrage. 99. All these indirect indications suggest that the left wing of the feminists shares the position of the WMPS on this issue. But CENSTKLE Premier Paki could. Who can guarantee that, having accepted the principle of property qualification in local government, our equality campaigners will not find it permissible to adopt this principle for the national legislature as well? Of course, they will hasten to hide behind a whole arsenal of tactical considerations. They will assure us that, in penetrating the walls of the legislature, property qualification advocates are also blazing the trail to full political rights for all women, that they will also be able to take women who do not meet the property qualification through the breach they have opened up. However, no matter how tempting these lovely fairy stories may sound, they remain nothing more than fairy stories intended for gullible souls. Their charms are mercilessly crushed by the truth of life. Examples are easy enough to find. How touchingly the Norwegian feminists spoke in defense of property qualified suffrage for women in local government elections. With what conviction they proved to proletarian women that, out of dedication to women's cause, they should be patient and wait until property qualified women take their places on equal terms with men. Of course, having attained rights for themselves, the advocates of the property qualification will spare no efforts to reorganize local government on truly democratic foundations. And did the bourgeois women make even a single attempt to do so? To the contrary, they distanced themselves even more dramatically from proletarian women, who continued to wage a persistent struggle for universal suffrage. When, in 1907, the issue of extending suffrage to women meeting certain property qualifications came on the agenda in the Storting, the feminists, with all their class passion, held fast to property qualifications, distancing themselves from the workers, who demanded the complete abolition of property qualifications. They even refused to participate in the grand demonstration organized by the working class for the purpose of supporting a bill that would extend the suffrage to all adult citizens, male and female, of Norway. Only time will tell what position the Norwegian feminists will stake out in the upcoming, spring 1909 election campaign, in which they will be participating for the first time as fully fledged citizens. However, the intention of the Workers' Party to turn this election campaign into a campaign to win universal suffrage has thus far met with an icy reception from the feminists. No matter what the feminists say, class instinct always proves more powerful than favorable impulses in the area of cross-class politics. For the moment, the feminists are united in their disenfranchisement with the Little Sisters, and the bourgeois women can, with complete sincerity, speak in favor of the general interests of women. But, once the distinction has been established, once bourgeois women have gained access to political activity, leaving their little sister in her disenfranchised position, those who just recently had defended the rights of all women turn into impassioned defenders of the privileges of their class. This is why, each time feminists start telling working-class women about the need to struggle together to realize some principle in the interest of all women, working-class women react to this demand with natural distrust, and, above all, try to make sure that there is not some new privilege exclusively for bourgeois women lurking in the wings. But, the offended equality campaigners will object, even if a certain measure of unconscious class calculation hides within our activities and aspirations, surely that does not diminish our work, our struggle for the political liberation of women. You surely cannot deny that we have achieved a number of things in the service of the cause of equal rights for women. Even allowing that proletarian women have preceded us in the struggle for women's economic independence, even allowing that they are practically ahead of us in solving the family problem, in the struggle for women's political emancipation, we cannot concede our primacy. We are the vanguard of the struggle for women's political rights. Remember Olympe de Gouges, remember all the great, sacred names of women, on both sides of the ocean, who laid down their lives for the ideal of women's political equality, and you will have to acknowledge that these pioneers of bourgeois feminism cleared the path for all women. Let us see whether this assertion is true. When the feminists paint us a picture of women's heroic liberation struggle, when they proudly tell us of their victories in the area of political equality, they usually bring out their pantheon of women's names, in which Olympe de Gouges, Rose Lacombe, Abigail Smith Adams, et.al., those first pioneers of feminism, take pride of place. It is from them that the feminists trace their lineage. And, considerably more importantly, it is to the images of these doubtlessly bright, charming, and heroic women that they attribute all achievements in the cause of raising the issue of political equality for women. The role played by the masses of women, the influence of the direct participation of the latter in the struggle for the political liberation of their countries, almost completely disappear from the field of view of these bourgeois equality campaigners. In evaluating, from their narrow feminist point of view, the public appearances of women in the period of the French Revolution, in the period of the struggle for the liberation of America, etc., they completely fail to take into account the enormous significance that women's participation in the general political struggle had for the cause of women's political emancipation, and they naively transfer all achievements in this area onto the shoulders of 2 or 3 heroic women who were able to bring about the feminist movement with their energy and dedication to the idea. Surrounded on all sides with hostile camps of men, the pioneers of women's emancipation selflessly fought for the acknowledgement of the principle of women's equality. In their relentless struggle with the other sex, the first champions of women's equality laid the foundation of the future feminist movement. Since then, women have walked on the true path, uniting with one another, and, in 1 century, achieved greater successes in the cause of their political liberation than women had managed in the entire prior history of humanity. But were these victories actually achieved by women in struggle with the other sex? Before us, there are 2 methods of struggle. One is general collaboration with those seeking to fundamentally change the structure of society, the other is unity amongst women in defense of their specifically female interests. Which of these 2 methods has actually influenced the fate of women's cause, and continues to do so now. Let us return to the days of the Great French Revolution. Here, beneath the surface, the feminists seek the beginnings of the contemporary bourgeois feminist movement. Women's position in the pre-revolutionary era was as sad and bad as that of men. In those days, there was true equality of the sexes, but it was equality of suffering, injustice, abuse, and oppression by feudalism and absolutism. 100. Women did indeed groan under the yoke of the very same hostile social forces. Peasant women, women artisans, and traders were plundered and destroyed as greedily by the royal treasury as their male counterparts, the biased, corrupt courts of the Ancien Regime. Persecuted its victims, male and female alike, with the same cruelty and injustice, sentencing them to the same cruel, ignominious punishments and tortures. And did hunger, that eternal, constant scourge of the French people in the pre-revolutionary period, spare women? To the contrary, they were doubly tortured by it, for themselves and for their children. Bitterness, desperation, and hatred built up equally in the hearts of the men and women of old France. Under such conditions, the great movement could not pass by French women without leaving a trace, independently of their own will. The representatives of the fair sex were drawn into the general movement of the people, into the great political struggle. Some went there to fight for freedom, equality, and the right to bread, and others in order to protect and defend their accustomed rights and privileges against the riotous rabble. Women left behind the peace of the hearth, abandoned their gilded salons, and walked down the thorny path of general political struggle. When the first thunderous sounds of the people's uprising were heard, the daughters of the people were on the front lines of the struggle for the liberation of their homeland. Judge for yourselves, what was more significant for the cause of women's political emancipation, for the acknowledgement of the principle of women's equality, the women's societies, clubs, journals, pamphlets, special women's petitions and appeals, or the first sparks of revolution thrown by women in Dauphine. 101. The Revolutionary Manifesto of the Women of Angers, that first sign of protest against arbitrary feudal monarchist rule, their participation in the storming of the Bastille, their courageous fighting in Versailles, their active collaboration with the federal movement in 1790, their selfless defense of the New France, their dedication to the cause of liberty. If we were to list all the heroic acts of the masses of women during the French Revolution, it would require an entire book. The women of Dauphine and Brittany were the first to challenge the government, they were followed by the female citizens of Angoulême and Chevanços. At the elections for deputies to the Estates General, peasant women and women of the petite bourgeoisie, having gathered privately, cast their votes, and no protest ensued from the chamber. On May 2, 1789, women fishmongers in Paris sent a delegation to the Electoral Assembly of the Third Estate in order to encourage the electors and remind the future deputies of their needs. On May 19, other women market traders, in turn, greeted the Electoral Assembly, insistently repeating to the deputies, "Do not forget the people, gentlemen." The women celebrated the joyous event of August 4 with a grand demonstration. In order to cover the deficit looming over the state, a first delegation of women appeared in the National Assembly on September 7, sacrificing their valuables on the altar of the country. On October 5, women raised the banner of revolt, and, with their own forces, carried out one of the largest actions of the revolution, the famous march to Versailles. After the king fled to Varennes, women expressed their indignation openly, and, following the installation of Louis XVI in Paris, they contested the honor of guarding the city gates with men. Women participated vigorously in the memorable petition on the Field of Mars, and were amongst the victims of the bloody massacre connected with that event. On June 20, 1792, a crowd of women could also be seen on the streets by the Tuileries, and in the Legislative Assembly, together with men. On the decisive day of August 10, when the last hour of the monarchy was struck, women fought in the front lines, and distinguished themselves with their fearlessness and courage. When, like the eerie sound of a tocsin, the news that the country is in danger spread across France. Women abandoned their peaceful feminine activities, armed themselves, and marched equally with male soldiers to the battlefields. Historians have found that they defended the cause of liberty no less passionately than men and defended democratic victories with their lives. At the same time, women raised their voices in defense of the deprived and needy segment of the population more often than men. Indeed, is it any wonder? The masses of women who joined the movement, after all, were themselves deprived and needy. All the oppression and injustice of the existing structure of society weighed even more heavily and palpably on them than on men. It was they, the fils du peuple, who organized women's riots in order to lower the artificially inflated prices of provisions. It was they who, with their energy and their selfless struggle, forced social assistance to be provided to the hungry and compelled a series of measures to be taken against bread resellers. Did these, and a long list of other actions by the masses of women that are omitted here, not contribute to the recognition, at least in principle, of equal civil rights for women? Even the most ardent feminist agitation paled into insignificance compared to the facts of women's active participation in the cause of the people as a whole. What practical significance could even the most glorious, the most eloquent defense of the principle of women's equality have if the latter had not already succeeded in presenting themselves as inspired fighters for freedom, as politically conscious citizens? For the most recent successes of women's political emancipation, the names of such outstanding revolutionary figures as Madame Roland, Robert Carolio, Théroigne de Méricourt, Legros, and other nameless female citizens who did not participate directly in the nascent feminist movement had the same significance as the names of Olympe de Gouges, Rose Lacombe, and Etta Dielders. To the contrary, these women's names, too, are intimately linked to the great events of the Revolution. The first feminists were, above all, champions of the people's freedom. Olympe de Gouges, to be sure, did not participate in street demonstrations. She could not be found in the ranks of the fighters on bloody, mutinous days, but reliable information indicates that her heart, no matter how ardently it burned with the desire for women's liberation, never ceased to beat in unison with those who fought for freedom and to ache with the suffering of the popular masses. Faced with the dominant hunger, she, by means of public appeals and her own example, succeeded in getting the entire mass of rich women to gift their valuables to the state with selfless willingness. She vividly described the shelters for the poor in Saint Denis, and attentively studied the burning question of growing poverty. To combat poverty, she initially called for the foundation of social assistance funds, but, after she became aware of the humiliation of receiving charity, she began to agitate in word and in print for the creation of exemplary state workshops for the unemployed, which was partially implemented. 102. For her, the cause of women's liberation was merely the logical consequence of the great cause of liberating the nation, the complete victory of the desired democracy over the hated feudal monarchist regime. Rose Lacombe gave herself to freedom's cause with perhaps even greater ardor than Olympe de Gouges. On August 10, she earned the civic wreath for her bravery. She unfailingly stood watch for the interests of the convention, appearing constantly with reports and proposals on that day. She became an implacable leader of the Republican and Revolutionary women's societies, using her enchanting eloquence not only to propagandize in the cause of women, but, even more, to serve the cause of freedom. Etta Dielders completely dedicated herself to organizing fraternal societies, competing in this regard with Louise Robert Carolio. Dielders' feminist aspirations gave rise to distrust and condemnation on the part of Louise Robert, but, like an intelligent politician, once she understood the intimate link existing between general democratic aspirations and the movement for women's liberation, she gradually changed her attitude towards the feminists and even gave space to the female question in Le Mercure National, the organ she edited. No matter how great the service of the first conscious feminists to the women's movement, however, in order for the question of women's equality to be posed practically to society, bare feminist principles were not enough. it was necessary for the masses of women to merge their forces with the general current of liberation in order to show themselves. In fact, as citizens, as interested as men in the victory of the New France over the Old. Not by submitting their own separate petitions, appeals, creating their own separate clubs, speaking of their rights as women and agitating for their specific, female interests did women acquire the halo of actual citizens in the eyes of their male contemporaries, but by standing in defense of their shared cause, side by side with men as equal comrades in the struggle. Distinguishing women's specific demands in the list of democratic demands was doubtlessly useful in the sense that it allowed special attention to be concentrated on them, helped awaken self-awareness amongst women themselves, but no matter how great the first feminists' achievements were, we must not forget that the very concept of equality of the sexes was born of women's struggle for the ideals of the people as a whole. In overstating the services rendered to the women's liberation movement by the first fighters for women's equality and simultaneously understating the significance of the general movement for democracy, the feminists are willing to reproach the French Revolution itself for not giving anything to women. Is this reproach just, and, if it is just, to what extent is it so? The least antagonism between the sexes was felt in the period preceding the French Revolution, and in the first years of the Revolution. When the people rose up in just outrage to break off their shackles, women entered the ranks of freedom fighters, and there met with a joyous reception from the men of their class. Not just the peasantry and the lowly urban masses, but the lights of the Third Estate, the middle and upper bourgeoisie, reacted with no hostility at all to women's emancipatory aspirations in their struggle for the natural rights of man. To a certain extent, they even supported these aspirations, viewing them as the logical conclusion of the democratic movement. To be sure, the question of women's equality was primarily abstract, but even that was a favorable symptom for women. Recall the signs of attention and sympathy with which all three French provisional governments encouraged women's entry into the social arena. When the women's delegates, Lasser tells us, appeared face to face with the people's representatives with petitions or donations to the people's cause, with proposals for services for national defense and armament, when their voices were raised from the remote provinces in statements on the formation by then of squads of Amazons or auxiliary squads for the National Guard, when they revealed abuses, injustices, dangers, and conspiracies with collective or individual petitions, or when they proposed a resolution on reforms, they were applauded and thanked. They were given accolades and mentioned in reports. 103. The repeated attempts by revolutionary legislation to reorganize the rearing and education of the youth based on the principles of equality of the sexes and democracy are a testament to the same sympathy for women and their emancipatory objectives. Is it not characteristic that, not long before the beginning of the French Revolution, a lycée, something like a free university, was organized at the initiative of Montesquieu, La Harpe, Condorcet, and other encyclopedists, that also opened its doors to women. Madame Roland, Tallien, and Sophie de Grouchy were regular visitors. In the very first year of the Revolution, one of the ideologues of the Third Estate, of democratic convictions, Condorcet, offered an enthusiastic defense of women's equality, basing his argument on demands for complete democratization and the premise of natural rights, equal for representatives of both sexes. A hostile attitude towards women's emancipatory aspirations, a loss of sympathy to them, could only be felt in the later period of the Revolution, only when the main enemy had already been defeated, the feudal monarchist system had been broken, and the Third Estate began to feel that they stood on solid ground. Further support by the Third Estate for extreme democratic demands threatened merely to stand in the way of the establishment of their class rule. And the convention decided to put a stop to women's emancipatory aspirations. In their anti-feminist speeches, their attacks on women's mad desire to become men, Amar and Chomet instinctively defended the privileges of the Third Estate against democratic inroads in the form of a hungry, exhausted, long-suffering female rabble that besieged and threatened the convention. In rejecting the demand for women's equality, the Third Estate were not so much taking a hostile attitude towards women as such as they were opposing inroads by the democracy of the poor on the new rights and liberties. Whereas, in the initial period of the revolution, women's demands were consonant with the revolutionary bourgeoisie. Once the Third Estate had achieved dominance, these demands were merely a manifestation of the burdensome dissatisfaction of the restless rabble, that eternal threat to the prosperity of the friends of order and property. During the revolution, the women's movement had merged so completely with the struggle for general democratic principles that, with the victory of the friends of property, property qualifications, and order, it was inexorably doomed. Women, who had been caught up in and carried away by the wave of popular outrage, found themselves stranded when the declining waves of the revolutionary current once again returned to the shore, forced to passively look on as the boats of bourgeois prosperity passed them by. However, despite this, when the feminists claim that the French Revolution gave women nothing, they are transgressing against historical truth. To be sure, the revolution did not yet bring about the liberation of women as such. But is it nonetheless possible to claim that women, as citizens, as human beings, won nothing from the fall of the old, pre-revolutionary regime? Surely the majority of the principles proclaimed by the Declarations of Rights of 1789 and 1798 applied equally to all French citizens without distinction as to sex. Surely the liberties and benefits associated with them also became the patrimony of French women. Surely the inviolacy of the individual, protection from the oppression and arbitrariness of feudalism, and notorious guarantee of private property, surely all of these gains of the revolution also concern the most essential interests of the female part of the French population. Freedom of conscience, equality before the court, the right not to be detained or arrested other than in the cases provided by law, all of these new gains were enjoyed by women on equal terms with men. From then on, women could freely and openly defend their views. And surely the right of divorce, invaluable for women, that was recognized by the revolution was not a trivial gain for them. Not to mention the establishment of freedom of occupation and the abolition of guild privileges. To be sure, the new regime did impose new fetters on women. It was the new regime that drafted the notorious Code Napoleon, which was so unfavorable to women. It was the new regime that legalized regulated prostitution and gave its imprimatur to humiliating regulations for women. The new regime also banned women forming associations and defending their interests as women by means of coalitions. However, in this case, the Third Estate was not so much attacking women, as it was attacking those women who could, in the ranks of the growing industrial proletariat, stand in defense of their class interests with the aid of associations. Did this ban not do even greater harm to the interests of the proletariat than to those of the pioneers of women's emancipation? Did the restrictive laws of post-revolutionary France impose greater impediments on the labor movement than the feminist movement? Only one thing remained both for women and for workers, settling for the few democratic gains left by the bourgeoisie in power. In an effort to remove all elements from their path that stood in the way of the definitive consolidation of their rule, the bourgeoisie took little notice of the demands of the working masses and completely ignored the requests of women. Indeed, that is quite natural. In those days, no specific class yet existed whose economic interests dictated the need for women's equality. Women's struggle for their political liberation only could, and only did, gain serious political significance in the context of the overall rise and development of the general labor movement, which sought to realize the ideal of true, full democracy. In America, where women's voices were raised in defense of their rights and equality even earlier than in France, the same intimate, inextricable link existed between the general democratic movement and the political movement of women that we observe in France. American women enthusiastically supported the emancipatory aspirations of their country and vigorously participated in the struggle for American independence. Names like Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Smith Adams are not only found in the lists of the first fighters for women's equality, but also have pride of place in America's struggle for liberation. Mercy Warren insisted on the need to separate from the metropolis even before Washington himself had decided to dream of such a thing. The Declaration of Independence was drafted with her direct participation. The demand for equal rights for women, those true comrades of the men who fought for freedom and democracy, was merely the logical conclusion of the general democratic aspirations of American citizens. This demand flowed so naturally from general democratic ideals, its realization drew such a clear line between the Old and New World that the very first two states of the young republic, New Jersey and Virginia, proclaimed equal voting rights for women and men. However, as soon as the jubilation over the victory won against the old system had died down and the old foe no longer threatened the interests of the middle and upper bourgeoisie, who had established themselves in power, extreme democracy ceased to elicit the same enthusiasm and sympathy from them. In drafting the principles of the federal Constitution, the young republic refused to grant political equality to its female comrades. Meanwhile, women themselves, who had joined shoulder to shoulder with men in the struggle and had never contemplated distinguishing their interests in front of the shared enemy, now appeared for the first time with purely feminist propaganda demanding the recognition of their political rights whilst awaiting the decision of the Constitutional Convention. However, the new Republican government was deaf to their demands and did nothing more than to grant women access to education on the same terms as men. That was the only gain the women who had fought for America's independence could boast. America and France can serve as illustrative examples of how negligible and weak feminists' efforts to realize their demands are in cases where they have no support from any social class that is fighting for its own interests. As long as it suited the bourgeoisie to support women's emancipatory aspirations, they supported their demands and even occasionally had the magnanimity to throw them a few crumbs, but as soon as they felt that they were on solid ground, all their efforts were directed at consolidating the newly won power for themselves alone. Then, they threw out women's demands together with the four-member electoral formula and other burdensome democratic demands as long as they did not meet with organized opposition from the broad, organized popular masses. But, the feminists hasten to object, there is no point in taking examples from such a remote period and digging up archaeological antiquities. Of course, at the time of the American independence struggle or that of the French Revolution, the influence of feminism on the success of women's cause was utterly negligible. The feminist movement had only just come into being, those were the first, abortive sparks of the coming, brightly burning flame. The bourgeois women's movement has gained strength and significance over the past 20 to 25 years, and, in order to evaluate the results obtained by it, we must take examples from the recent past, weigh the achievements of feminism in those countries where women have actually won something, where women's political equality has been won in practice. However, if we limit ourselves, for the sake of complete impartiality, to those countries where women have equal political rights to men, can we state with conviction that women do in fact owe the victory of their demands to the successes of bourgeois feminism? But do the efforts of the bourgeois women's movement not, always and everywhere, fall to pieces against the recalcitrant resistance of the bourgeoisie, and are the feminists not completely powerless to break this resistance as long as their demands do not coincide with those of a live democratic struggle in which they find active support? Look how persistently the British feminists have, since 1867, besieged the Parliament with their petitions demanding equalization of their rights with those of men. The British women's movement is one of the most influential in the world, its effect on public opinion is by no means negligible, and, nonetheless, Parliament persists in dismissing women's demands. If, in the most recent past, members of Parliament have begun to be more favorably inclined to the question of political equality for women, if society, too, is showing greater sympathy towards it, is that not because that demand of women is decisively defended by the working class? Bourgeois feminists love to point with pride to their victories and refer to Australia, 4 states in North America, Norway and Finland as countries where, thanks to the efforts of feminists, the principle of women's political equality has been realized in practice. However, do the feminists have sufficient grounds to attribute these undeniable victories of women's cause to their own efforts? Let us take the example nearest to us, Finland, the first country in Europe to grant women equal political rights to men. Positively breathless from joy, the feminists praise the achievements of the bourgeois women's organizations, the Union and the Finnish Women's Alliance, and inform us of the extraordinary successes of the feminist movement in Finland. As an admonition to other countries, they note the close link that supposedly existed between women of all social classes and caused proletarian and bourgeois women to fight closely together in defense of the general women's demand for political rights. The solution to the mystery of the rapid large-scale success of women's cause in Finland lies in the solidarity of women. This is what feminists claim. The reality was totally different. Finland is a country with clearly delineated class contradictions. The bourgeois and proletarian women's movements here were clearly delineated from one another from the very beginning. The working-class women's unions that came together in 1900 immediately joined the Workers' Party, forming a sort of subsidiary of it to serve the female proletariat. The Finnish feminist movement, on the other hand, bore a clear bourgeois imprint from the very moment it appeared on the scene, and exclusively served the interests of respectable society ladies. It carefully avoided everything that smacked of radicalism, and approached even such a unifying demand as women's suffrage with great caution. At the General Women's Congress in 1904, which was also attended by representatives of the Workers' Party, the bourgeois union continued to insist on equal political rights for women on the existing foundations, i.e., preserving the property qualifications, the four-chamber system of representation, and the plurality vote. The Finnish Women's Alliance went even further, insisting on granting women only active suffrage. The union expended no small amount of strength and energy on counter-agitation with a view to counteracting the implementation of complete political equality for women. They explained their approach with concerns about the fate of women's cause. If you demand a lot at the start, you risk getting nothing. One must be prudent and take a gradual approach, winning concessions step by step. However, in reality, the esteemed ladies were quite simply afraid that ignorant, dangerous proletarian women, with their red flags and red ideas, might join the ranks of legislators. This can be seen from the position the bourgeois female deputies of Finland's Sejm took on their current comrades, women of the working class. The well-known feminist, Baroness Greipenberg, a member of the International Women's Alliance, feels no compunction to state at women's meetings in Europe that the extension of the franchise to all male and female citizens of Finland is an enormous political mistake. Only the bias of the feminists allows the achievement of political equality for women in Finland to be attributed to the bourgeois women's movement. This victory came as a complete surprise for the bourgeois champions of women's equality themselves. Even now, they are unable to comprehend the causes of it, and do not know whom to credit with this surprising success. Entire legends are made on this basis. At one meeting of equality campaigners in St. Petersburg, one of the prominent activists of our feminist movement, based on the words of Finnish equality campaigners, reported that the demand for women's suffrage was only included in the bill under the threat that women of all social strata would leave the ranks of the political parties to which they belonged. The terrified men, of course, had no other choice but to give in to the onslaught of their demanding, threatening female comrades. More thoughtful feminists have a different explanation for this victory. In Finland, the sexes have long been educated together, and that fact subtly prepared people's minds to recognize women's equality. Lastly, a third group believes that the main cause lies in the fact that women participated alongside men in the struggle to restore the overthrown constitution. In that difficult moment, women, chiefly educated women, naturally, conducted themselves in such an exemplary fashion, showed such political tact, such an understanding of the importance of the events, that men deemed it their duty to repay them, and rewarded their exemplary conduct by extending the franchise to them. 104. The feminists look for all manner of explanations for their success. There is only one that they do not wish to acknowledge, that they owe their victory completely to the working class. Without a doubt, there were entirely specific, objective conditions in Finland that facilitated the realization of women's equality, but these objective conditions would not have sufficed had the working class not written the clearly formulated demand for universal suffrage without distinction as to sex on their banner. In the struggle for the restoration of the constitution, the bourgeois classes of Finland were forced, nolens volens, to seek support from the broad popular masses. Only by establishing full democracy could the Finns gain support against the threat of hostile influences from without. However, the bourgeoisie vacillated for a long time before agreeing to make concessions and support the demands of the extreme parties. An enormous amount of energy, a major expenditure of force by the Social Democrats was necessary in order to win the inclusion of the 5-member electoral formula in the new constitutional laws. The female proletariat, in the ranks of their party, worked actively in that very direction. As early as the Tampere Congress of 1905, working-class women introduced a resolution expressing the decision of proletarian women that they would no longer submit any petitions to the Sejm, but would demand and, by all means necessary, obtain a fundamental reform of the representative system. In Finland, the events of October were preceded by a series of demonstrations by women of the working class, which did not cease even after the publication of the October Manifesto. On December 17, 1905, working-class women organized meetings all over Finland that were attended by more than 10,000 women. On December 30 in Helsinki, another demonstration of women took place, in which peasant women from the surrounding areas participated actively. Social democracy stood at the head of the proletarian women's movement, fighting for the complete democratization of representation. Any time the proletariat displayed a certain vacillation and uncertainty as to whether the matter of political equality for women should be removed from the agenda, the organized segment of the female proletariat were able to remind their male comrades with their tenacity and fortitude how harmful such an inappropriate concession would be to the interests of the class as a whole. More than once, the feminists took advantage of this in order to jab the Social Democrats for their neglectful attitude towards women's political equality, and used it as proof of the need for a separate feminist movement. In so doing, however, they forgot to take note of one quite important fact, i.e., that the general feminist movement was completely superfluous here. It was not the bourgeois champions of women's rights, but working-class women themselves who reminded all concerned of women's democratic demands and forced the popular masses to take the growing demands of the female world into account. The events in Finland only illustrate the proposition that, where proletarian women themselves stand guard for their interests, where they insistently remind men of their most immediate demands, those demands will be realized the soonest. It would be an enormous mistake to presume that the feminists in Finland actually played a decisive role in the victory of women's suffrage. It was during the hardest, most hotly contested battles, in times of acute struggle for the democratization of the Finnish state, that the least was heard from the feminists. Had proletarian women ridden the coattails of the bourgeois feminists, had they indeed entrusted their fate to these cautious, prudent bourgeois organizations, the question of political equality for women would have taken many years to resolve. However, class consciousness was the salvation of the women of the Finnish proletariat. They remained in the ranks of their party, and, struggling together for the interests of the class as a whole, they simultaneously also won the realization of their specific demands as women. No matter how much the feminists boast of the victory for women's cause in Finland, this victory was entirely the result of working-class struggle. The fact that it came from the ranks of a powerful political party and was supported by the organized forces of the proletariat, was the only reason that the Finnish Senate, the Finnish bourgeoisie, and Finnish society seriously took the demand for women's political equality into account. If it had only been the feminists going on about women's equality, Finnish society would hardly have found it necessary to take them into account, no matter how great their numbers. Even smaller was the role of bourgeois feminism in winning women's suffrage in Australia. In South Australia, reports W. Reeves, who is acquainted with the facts, the entire struggle for women's political rights was initiated, waged, and brought to an end almost exclusively by men. The role played in this by Miss Spence, Miss Nichols, and their allies was, of course, useful, but its significance was entirely secondary. 105. Even smaller was the influence of the bourgeois women's movement on the outcome of the struggle for political reform linked to the extension of suffrage to women in New Zealand and Western Australia. In South Australia, there was at least the Women's Suffrage League, which had been in operation since 1888, also active there was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was incomparably more popular than the WSL. Not even this existed in New Zealand. There were no feminist organizations here, no specifically female agitation or propaganda took place here. Even with the most generous exaggeration, one could not say that even a single female orator or women's movement leader in New Zealand had struggled in the front lines and had a significant influence on shifting public opinion. 106. Nonetheless, a bill was passed there in 1893 that granted full political rights to women. Similar bills were passed, in South Australia in 1895, in Western Australia in 1900, in New South Wales in 1902, in Tasmania in 1903, and, lastly, in Queensland in 1905. What forces, what factors, then, facilitated the realization of the most deeply held goal of the feminists if, according to those familiar with the facts, their own efforts had nearly no influence on the realization of the principle of political equality for women? As the matter of political rights for women grows beyond the stage of being an abstract principle dear to the hearts of feminists alone, and transforms into a slogan of contemporary political struggle, it inevitably touches the interests of all existing political parties in one way or another. Of course, attitudes towards the matter will vary depending on what social group is proposing and supporting it. At the same time, the very principle of women's equality takes on quite different appearances depending on what party, to what end, puts this demand of women on the agenda. It goes without saying that, more often than not, this demand is made and supported by the working class, which has a direct interest in the further democratization of the state. However, there are political situations in which it proves beneficial for other, purely bourgeois parties to support the principle of political equality for women, when the realization of this women's slogan is capable of serving the interests of the bourgeois strata of the society. Normally in such cases, bourgeois parties will propose limited, property-qualified suffrage for women. However, it does happen that they find it useful to defend even full equality for women. This was the approach taken at times by Belgian clerics, who had insisted on property qualifications. This approach was taken more than once by bourgeois parties in America, Australia, France, Denmark, and other countries. Women's suffrage is proposed as a sort of antidote to universal suffrage for men. Thousands of hopes are rested on women as a less conscious and more conservative element. When the Conservative Landowners Party in Western Australia needed to increase the number of their supporters in order to counteract the young party of the gold diggers that had started to win excellent political victories over the settled population of the territory, the Conservatives turned to women's suffrage. The ground was shaking under the feet of the solid landowners, the old, accustomed structure threatened to collapse under the onslaught of newcomers, the party of the goldfield workers. It was necessary to take decisive measures. Granting women access to the ballot box promised to increase the number of voters of the Conservative Landholders Party, given that the majority of the female residents of Western Australia belonged to the class of farmers and stockmen. Amongst the nomadic gold diggers, on the other hand, they were only found in insignificant numbers. In the hands of the Conservatives, women's political equality was a trump card with which the old men hoped to beat the restless, homeless proletarian element of the young party of the gold diggers. However, this calculation proved erroneous. In the very first elections to the federal parliament, the advocates of free trade and the interests of the working class emerged victorious, and Forrest's party, who had by then already lost their leader, lost their previous leading position. 107. In New Zealand and South Australia, the matter of political equality for women was also raised, depending on current conditions, either by progressives or by conservatives. However, credit for the final victory of the Bill on Women's Rights is due exclusively to the working class. In 1891, the Conservative Hall, then in opposition, hoping to undermine the prestige of a ministry composed of members of the Progressive Party, demanded that the government introduce a bill on extending political rights to women in Parliament. In hopes of saving the popularity of the party and the ministry, the Prime Minister not only did not dismiss the Conservatives' demand, but introduced the bill in Parliament. However, the Progressives, who had not committed to voters to support the principle of women's political equality and had not wished to stand in support of a bill that had been introduced at the insistence of a rival party, refused to support the government's proposal. The defeat of the bill appeared inevitable. But the new Labour element, Reeves says, spoke in favour of the reform and supported it on the strength of purely personal conviction without any connection to such circumstances. In this way, the reform easily passed the lower house. 108. In the upper house, it was passed by a majority of only 2 votes, exclusively thanks to the support of the Temperance Party, which enjoyed the sympathy of the working class. Though Conservatives and Progressives in Australia gave way to the slogan of political equality for women only as a means of struggling against one another, the Workers' Party fought for women's rights in all areas with the same tenacity and commitment to the cause. In New Zealand, as here in Australia, the members of Parliament belonging to the Labour Party, to a man, cast their vote in favour of granting suffrage to women. 109. The fact that women in Australia and New Zealand now enjoy political rights, unrestricted rights, at that, is entirely thanks to the active support of the working class, whose vital interests are most intimately and inextricably linked with this demand of women. Is it not typical that, whenever and wherever the question of granting women access to the political life of the country first arises, the bourgeois parties first seek to limit themselves to the introduction of a bill in Parliament that extends the franchise only to women meeting a property qualification? It took no small effort on the part of the democratic element in Parliament to counteract these attempts by the bourgeoisie to even further consolidate their rule with the aid of female voters. If the feminist movement hardly played any role in introducing women's suffrage in Australia, its influence on the realization of this principle in 4 states of North America, Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, and Idaho, was hardly any greater. It should be noted that women were granted equal political rights to men in these states back when they were still merely territories that did not enjoy the same rights as states. The population of the new territories was significantly more democratic in character than the thorough bourgeois spirit of the conservative element of the population of the old, long-serving states. In the territory, every radical reform in favor of democracy did not meet the same resistance it elicited from the proprietary haute bourgeoisie of the states. The territory of Wyoming granted political rights to all of its relatively small number of inhabitants without distinction as to sex in 1869. Later, when the territory of Wyoming was transformed into a state, the Federal Congress did not see any need to change the fundamental points of the constitution of the former territory, and thus, women's political rights were preserved. In the territory, now a state, of Utah, political rights were already extended to women in 1870. This reform was passed by the established population, the Mormons, who intended to include their wives in political life, thus weakening the influence of the element of overwhelmingly proletarian newcomers. Here, too, women's suffrage was meant to act as an antidote against the machinations of democratic elements that had begun to get a grip on power. In the struggle with the Mormons, the Federal Congress initially disenfranchised all residents of Utah, both men and women, who advocated polygamy in 1882, and later, in 1887, politically disenfranchised women in Utah in general. Only thereafter, when Utah became a state, did the Federal Congress restore women's previous political rights. The power struggle between the various social strata and political parties constantly causes them to grasp at the demand for political equality for women and place it on the agenda at a time when this reform promises some benefit or other to one or another group or party. The American Republicans and Democrats, one or the other of whom have supported this demand, are of course quite unconcerned with the victory in principle of women's cause, Any expression by them of sympathy for women's political equality is based solely on the benefits the reform promises to offer them. The demand for political equality for women is either placed on the agenda or returned to politicians' back pockets depending on the political situation. For the majority of the bourgeois parties, this is a sort of chess move that allows them to pin their adversaries against the wall. However, it is this very attitude that makes the support of the bourgeois parties both weak and unreliable. Though the working class played a less prominent role in the extension of the franchise to women than in Finland or Australia, though the reform there was, to a greater extent, the fruit of diplomatic maneuvers by bourgeois parties struggling to gain power, we must at the same time take note of the characteristic fact that, in those North American states where women's suffrage has been introduced, the feminist movement was either completely absent or not very well developed at the time of the reform. To listen to the feminists, it would seem that the success of women's cause should depend on the degree of development of the feminist movement. However, in reality, we observe the exact opposite. In countries, like the territories of North America, Australia, New Zealand, and even Finland, where the bourgeois women's movement is still poorly developed, where it is not yet firmly rooted, women are winning political rights, at the same time as in Britain, the older states of North America, Sweden, Germany, and other countries, with much broader and more influential feminist movements, women are still politically disenfranchised. 110. How can we explain this phenomenon? Are the facts discussed above not a testament, on the one hand, to the powerlessness of bourgeois feminism to emancipate women, and, on the other hand, to the fact that the matter of women's political equality has already grown beyond its initial stage, and transformed from a narrow female demand to one of the practical slogans of our day? For the success of women's cause, this is in any case a favorable indicator. If women's victories depended only on the degree of power and strength of the feminist movement, women would have to wait a long time before at last attaining the desired results. The feminists boast of the successes in Norway and Denmark, successes attained in recent years with a relatively well-developed feminist movement. However, a closer look at exactly what took place in Norway suffices to show that there were socio-political factors completely unrelated to feminism that led to the realization of the reform in the interest of women. When, in 1901, the question of granting all adult inhabitants of municipalities the right to vote was placed on the agenda, and the ruling bourgeoisie felt in that demand the power of the democratic elements asserting it, they quickly resorted to tried and true measures and countered the demand for universal suffrage in the municipalities by calling for suffrage for women meeting a specified property qualification. This reform saw off the danger of an undesired democratization of local government that would grant harmful and ignorant proletarian elements access to it. The liberal reform of 1901, which included women in local government, completely satisfied the reactionary bourgeoisie, and elicited cries of joy amongst the bourgeois feminists. This reform harmed only the interests of proletarians of both sexes. But what did that matter to the champions of the principle of women's equality? The very same pure class calculation guided the Norwegian Liberal Party when, in 1907, they began to persistently advocate women's suffrage. In the Storting against the Conservatives and the Social Democrats. At the time, the Conservatives were opposed to political equality for women in general, the Social Democrats were waging a persistent struggle for unrestricted suffrage, and only the Liberals, who had weighed all the benefits promised to their party by property qualified representation of women, advocated a bill in the Storting that granted political rights only to women meeting a specified property qualification. The simple fact that the Liberals refused to vote for another bill, introduced by the Social Democrats, that provided unrestricted suffrage for women, suffices to show that it was not love of abstract justice or the principle of women's equality that led the Liberals to become such zealous defenders of women's interests. By 121 votes to 48, the Social Democrats' bill was voted down and the Liberals' proposal adopted. However, women even owe the adoption of property qualified voting rights for women to the support of the Social Democrats. the representatives of the working class exhausted every possibility in the struggle to pass actual democratic representation for women, but when they were faced with the question of whether to vote down the property qualified bill by voting against it together with the conservatives, or defend at least restricted, diluted suffrage for women, they chose the latter as the lesser evil. As a result of the 1907 electoral reform, 300,000 women have now been added to the number of fully fledged citizens, but 250,000 of the most exploited, deprived, and oppressed even now remain deprived of the possibility of defending and asserting their interests. What did the Norwegian feminists do in this doubtlessly critical moment? Where did their sympathies lie, and how were they manifested? We already noted their ambivalent behavior above. The feminists, those passionate champions of the principle of women's equality, not only did not support the demand for unrestricted suffrage, but pointedly distanced themselves from the representatives of the proletariat, expressing their clear sympathy to bourgeois liberalism and vesting in it all their hopes. In refusing to walk together with their little sisters, the women of the proletariat, in that critical moment, they forgot all the lofty promises that they had just recently made to the trusting women of the working class. At the upcoming 1909 Storting elections, in which Norwegian women will have access to the ballot box for the first time, bourgeois feminists will have occasion to show in practice whether they are indeed on the side of actual political equality for women, or whether, by the principle of women's equality, they only mean the possibility of equally sharing power with men in the existing class society. The Norwegian government, under pressure from the Social Democrats, intends to introduce a bill in the next Storting, i.e., in 1909, that extends the franchise to all citizens, male and female, aged 25 and older, without any property qualification. What stance will the bourgeois women deputies take on this? Will they support the widespread campaigning that the Social Democrats have decided to carry out around this issue? It was the same naked class calculation that guided the Danish bourgeoisie in passing the electoral reform that also included women in local government. The feminists, who rejoice at this new victory, not only welcome it as a partial victory, but as a victory in principle, the consequence of which will be the extension of political rights to women in all areas of political life in the more or less near future. But this victory, in principle, is nothing more than a new weapon for the bourgeoisie to aim against the democratization of local government. 111. The class parliament was faced with a dilemma, whether to grant access to local government to all inhabitants or carry out a liberal reform entirely in principle that extended the right to vote to women who meet the property qualification in order to avoid inspiring distrust amongst the solid bourgeoisie. They opted for the latter reform. It did not harm the interests of the bourgeoisie, and was quite radical. However, this time, too, the feminist movement had only indirect influence of the passage of this reform. The entire role of the bourgeois advocates of equality boiled down to taking a position in support of the interests of the propertied bourgeoisie at the time of the struggle for local government reform. Even when the feminists are extreme advocates of equality, their demands are by no means a threat to the rule of the bourgeoisie. The main concern of the Danish equality campaigners was dissociating themselves from the demands of the Workers' Party, showing their solidarity with the prudent policy of the liberals and condemning the reckless extremism of working-class politics. In May 1908, pacified by their first victory in Denmark, the feminists organized a brilliant, boisterous celebration of their purely ladylike success in Copenhagen. They also invited proletarian women to celebrate this win in principle for women together with them. The celebration was meant to show gratitude towards the government for taking such a highly humane and radical view. But proletarian women refused to join in celebrating a victory for the principle of women's equality that had been bought at such a high price. The new electoral law not only deprived the impoverished female population of representation in local government, but went so far as to reduce the rights of even the male proletariat compared to the previous law. For their part, the proletarian women organized a demonstration in protest against the law, but, of course, the bourgeoisie, pacified by their victory, had no desire to support their little sisters this time. In summing up the above examples, we cannot escape the conclusion that, in all countries, the feminist movement played a most insignificant role in the practical attainment of political rights. Only time will tell whether the future actions of the suffragists will be more successful in this regard, whether the new ascendancy of the feminist movement, concentrated particularly in Britain, will yield greater results. For now, we can only say that the demand for women's political equality has only been realized in two ways, either under direct pressure from the proletariat, who demand the complete democratization of the representative system, or under their indirect influence in cases where the bourgeois parties grasped at women's suffrage as a panacea for the looming proletarian peril. But whilst, in the first case, the issue at hand was always unrestricted suffrage for women, in the second, the bourgeoisie sought to rely only on property qualified representation. It is only possible to trust in the victory of complete political equality for women when the masses of the working class stand in defense of this demand. Let us, lastly, look at what the bourgeois women's movement has done here in Russia in the interests of political equality for women. 112. To listen to our equality campaigners, their contributions in this area have been invaluable. But was it under their influence that Russian society took an interest in women's demands? Was it pressure from feminist organizations that led political unions and parties to include demands for political equality for women in their programs? What of the fact that feminists abroad have thus far only attained minor results in the struggle for women's liberation? Of course, our feminists, who managed to inspire sympathy for women's demands in Russian society, will be able to attain their coveted goal faster and more simply than their sisters abroad. But did sympathy for women's equality honestly develop in Russian society as a result of the manifestations of bourgeois feminism? Had sight of the shining image of women fighters not long since accustomed Russian society to seeing women as conscious, active citizens? But can these selfless images of women fighters really be attributed to the bourgeois feminist movement? There cannot be the slightest doubt that these thousands of women who lost their lives in anonymity had enormous significance for societal attitudes towards women's equality, a significance that is immeasurably greater than even the most heartfelt feminist appeals and the furious speeches of women's equality advocates. Remember how warmly these selfless images were spoken of in the First Duma. Even the representatives of the bourgeois party appeared to feel indebted to them. The halo surrounding these women fighters also cast light on the whole female question in Russia. We are saying that electoral law must be reformed on the basis of a four-member formula, exclaimed Deputy Rizhkov to thunderous applause. We are forgetting in this first Russian parliament about Russian women, who, side by side with the others, fought for freedom. We are forgetting that the son of a slave woman cannot be a citizen. But it is not these Russian women that the feminists recall when they speak of the contributions of those who fight for women's emancipation. In their blind self-aggrandizement, our feminists are not even able to take note of the socio-political motives that, over time, led Russian society to support the demand for political equality for women. It is as if they do not notice that the efforts of the opposition to support all democratic demands were a powerful factor in this case, that the living, driving force, women's mass participation in the general liberation movement, made women's aspirations for political equality a real, live slogan. That the selfless commitment of a certain category of women to the cause of freedom did away with old prejudices about women's lack of political consciousness, their slavish instincts and conservative inclinations. Just as women's active participation in the liberation struggle served as the impetus to raise the question of women's equality in France in the days of the Great Revolution, here, too, it was not specifically feminist campaigning, but women's vibrant love for the cause of the social liberation of humanity, the organic merger of democratic men and women in the struggle for a new political system that, step by step, allowed the idea of women's political capacity to take root in social consciousness. Is there even a single major event from the emancipatory period we just experienced in which the participation of working-class women, peasant women and women of the intelligentsia was not indispensable? The achievements of heroic individuals in the cause of the people's liberation are disputed, and not without success, by the grey masses of women in the latent impulse that broke their age-old shackles. Remember the procession of women's riots that took place everywhere between 1904 and 1906. The impetus was the war with Japan. The burden of all the horrors, all the hardships, all the social and economic evil connected to that ill-fated war lay on the shoulders of peasant women, wives, and mothers. When the reserves were called up, their already burdened shoulders were burdened with double the work, double the concern, unexpectedly forced those dependent women who feared everything beyond their narrow domestic interests to face their heretofore unknown hostile forces head-on and, for the first time, to palpably feel all the humiliations of disenfranchisement, to fully experience all the sorrow of undeserved affronts. Those grey, forgotten peasant women, who for the first time left the comfort of their nests, hastened to the cities, there to cross the thresholds of government institutions in search of news of their husbands, sons, fathers, to seek assistance, to defend their interests. All the disenfranchisement of the peasantry, all the falsity and injustice of the existing social structure in all its ugliness peasant women saw with their own astonished eyes. From the city, they returned, sobered and tempered, holding in their hearts an endless supply of sorrow, hate, and anger. In the summer of 1905, a series of women's riots erupted. With fierce hatred and astonishing daring for women, the women smashed the military and police administrations, repelled reservists. Arming themselves with rakes, pitchforks, and brooms, the peasant women evicted companies of guards out of their towns and villages. In their own way, they protested against the unbearable burden of the war. They were, of course, arrested, convicted, and sentenced to cruel punishments. But the women's riots did not cease. And, in this protest, the defense of general peasant interests and women's interests merged so closely that any attempt to separate the one from the other, to attribute the women's riots to the feminist movement, is utterly unfounded. After the political actions of the peasant women came a series of women's riots that were economic in nature. This was the era of ubiquitous peasant agitation and agricultural strikes. The peasant women frequently were the instigators of this agitation, and led the men to join in. There were cases in which, having failed to gain the sympathy of the peasant men, the peasant women alone went to the manor houses with their demands and ultimatums. Arming themselves with whatever was to hand, they walked in front of the men to meet the forces sent to quell the uprisings. The Baba, who had for centuries been beaten down and oppressed, unexpectedly found herself as one of the indispensable actors in the unfolding political drama. Over the entire revolutionary period, in close, unbreakable unity with the men, she unwaveringly stood guard for the interests of the peasantry as a whole, reminding all of her own specific needs as a woman with remarkable internal timing only when it did not threaten to harm the cause of the peasantry as a whole. This did not mean that peasant women remained indifferent to their demands as women, as if ignoring them. To the contrary, the mass appearance of peasant women on the general political arena, their mass participation in the general struggle, consolidated and developed women's self-awareness. As early as November 1905, peasant women in Voronezh province sent 2 delegates to the Peasant Congress with a mandate from the women's meeting to demand political rights and freedom for women on equal terms with men. 113. The enthusiasm with which women at the time grabbed hold of the idea of women's equality can be seen from a report from members of the Alliance for Women's Equality who had been working amongst peasant women and gathering signatures from them for a petition to the First Duma. The idea of equal rights, a member of the A who had been working in Tula province states, appealed to them, to say the least. For them, it was their long-awaited daily bread, as one married peasant woman put it. If you heard the stories, brought forth under the vivid impression of the petition, of women's sorrow, of the painful disenfranchisement of women, that I have heard whilst writing down illiterate women's names at their heartfelt request, you would have felt the warmest joy at having participated actively in such a truly great cause as women's liberation. The only things that compare to it are the liberation from serfdom and the emancipation of the Negroes. I had never heard such sorrow as poured out before me at that time. It all accumulated and surged forth throughout the land, so much so that, if equality does not take hold in the village, it would be possible, if one acted skillfully, to carry out a grand women's strike against all those who do not recognize women's rights. Signatures were added to the Alliance for Women's Equality petition to the Second Duma with even greater intensity. Entire villages signed. Not satisfied with merely signing, the peasant women issued a sort of judgment on the matter of women's rights then and there. The women who gathered signatures report that peasant women came from afar, not intimidated by the distance, just to subscribe to the petition. Old women brought their underage granddaughters, asking that they, too, should not be overlooked. Adolescent girls, often enough independent householders, protested if their signatures were rejected. How can this be? We're old enough to starve, old enough to feed and clothe orphans, but when it comes to our rights, we're not old enough, they exclaimed with indignation. Peasant women not only expressed their demands as women through the law, they also acted completely independently. It suffices to recall the historic letters, mandates from peasant women of the provinces of Voronezh and Tver, sent to the First State Duma, or the telegram sent to Deputy Aladdin by peasant women of the village of Nogatkino. In this great moment of right against power, we, peasant women of the village of Nogatkino, salute the elected representatives of the people who demanded the resignation of the ministry in an expression of distrust towards the government. We hope that the representatives supported by the people will give the people land and freedom, open the prison doors to those who fight for the freedom and happiness of the people, and grant civil and political rights both to themselves and to us, Russian women, who are disenfranchised and deprived even in our own families. Remember that a slave woman cannot be the mother of a free citizen. The female peasant population of the Caucasus defended their rights with particular vigor. Peasant women from Guria issued resolutions at peasant meetings in Kutaisi Governorate demanding equal political rights to men. At a meeting of rural and urban political actors that took place in the province of Tbilisi on the matter of the introduction of the Zemstvo ordinance in the Caucasus, the delegates from the local population included Georgian women who insistently reminded those present of their rights as women. Of course, together with demands for political equality, peasant women everywhere also raised their voices in defense of their economic interests. The matter of shares, of land, was as great a concern for peasant women as for peasant men. In some places, peasant women, who had passionately supported the idea of expropriating privately held land, cooled to the measure when doubts arose about whether shares would also be distributed to women. If the land is taken from the landlords and just given to men, the peasant women worried, then we, the women, will be in complete bondage. Now at least we are able to make a few kopecks of our own on the farm, but that way, we just have to work for the menfolk. 114. Here, Zhensky Vystnik hastens to draw the conclusion that the expropriation of land for the peasantry in general would be a great injustice towards women, finding that it is difficult to expect progress in such a civilization, when even a liberal reform is a means of even greater enslavement and disenfranchisement of half the population. Working-class women showed up at electors' assemblies to break up the meetings and prevent elections being conducted. The enormous number of signatures from working women gathered on women's petitions is a testament to the fact that proletarian women had ceased to be indifferent to their disenfranchisement, that the impossibility of asserting and defending their interests by open, legal means was distressing to them. According to the feminists themselves, of 40,000 signatures gathered for women's petitions to the First and Second State Dumas, the overwhelming majority came from proletarian women. Working-class women were irreplaceable participants in all women's meetings in the period of 1905 to 1906, listening, trustingly, to the voice of our equality campaigners, the champions of the cause of women. But the feminists' proposals did not meet their awakening needs and did not resonate with their pained souls. In response to a meeting organized in spring 1907 by equality campaigners who sympathized with the cadets, 3 meetings were organized, at the initiative of working-class women. In the Nobel House, 2 in the spring, and 1 in the autumn of 1907. The attendees were overwhelmingly women of the proletariat, and even the working-class women who spoke from the platform of their specific needs as women called upon their class comrades to support and fight for the interests of women of the working class. The convening of the first women's congresses led working-class women to take a lively interest in the upcoming event in the feminist world. And even though working-class women have no illusions about the upcoming Congress, although they expect no practical results from it, this bourgeois initiative, given the current mood amongst women workers, is still bound to play a certain role in the awakening self-awareness of proletarian women. However, this awakening will, of course, be of a totally different character than the feminists expect. Women workers are drawn by their growing self-awareness to the side opposite that of feminism. Women workers are beginning to pay greater attention to their needs as women, beginning to demand protection for their health as mothers, to raise the issue of their rights in all areas of social and political life. But surely these demands do not contradict the program of the working class. In defending their specific interests as women, women workers are at the same time defending the interests of their class. However intensive, however pressing women's most immediate demands may be, any gains made in this area can only be of real significance to women of the working class against the background of shared gains, improved working conditions, democratization of the state, etc. The mere principle of equality remains, and, indeed, cannot but remain, empty noise for working-class women. But the feminists cannot agree with this manner of posing the question. Blinded by their slogan, uniting all women to conquer the world, they extend their hands to peasant women, proletarian women, warning them not to trust their class comrades. In an attempt to play purely female notes and thus win women's hearts, they go into the proletarian and peasant milieu with naive man-hating sermons. They seek to replace the concept of class struggle with the artificial idea of discord between the sexes, seeking to unload the guilt in the oppressed position of women. Workers and peasants from the shoulders of the propertied classes onto those of abstract men. Men, they say, seeking to propagandize the feminist mindset amongst women workers and peasants, need women's enslavement. 116. Carried away by their narrow feminist ideals, they even claim in their awkward language that the female question will inevitably be immeasurably broader and immeasurably more significant than the great worker question. 117. Do they not even understand that, by dissociating themselves from their male comrades, renouncing their tasks as a class for the sake of narrow female objectives, working-class women would cease to be the social force that they are now, and, in so doing, would not only not strengthen, but would, to the contrary, actually undermine the significance of women's cause? Women's demands, adapted to satisfy women of opposite poles of society, would lose all their specificity, even if the ranks of the army of women defending them were to grow by a factor of 10. Currently, the political demands now raised by women of the working class only enjoy the significance of a fact of enormous political importance because the vital interest of a specific social class stands behind them. But in those cases where bourgeois equal rights campaigners use democratic slogans, when they demand political rights for all adult citizens, they can be sure that that demand of theirs will always find lively resonance and active support in the working class. In vain, the feminists feign disbelief at this, in vain, they list the socialists' insidious betrayals of the cause of women's political liberation with spiteful smugness. This is not the place to discuss the tactics of the Workers' Party in the matter of winning women's suffrage. It suffices to note that although in some countries, under highly specific political conditions, the position adopted on the subject by the socialists was not free of opportunism, this inconsistency in their tactics was definitively rejected and condemned at the subsequent International Congress in Stuttgart. 118. The first issue of Soyuz-Genshin in 1908 features a specific list of the wrongs of social democracy against the principle of women's political equality. It would seem that, in Belgium, when even the clerics were willing to recognize the principle of women's equality, the socialists, for some reason, found it untimely to extend the franchise to women and convinced women in the party to abandon their efforts to include women's suffrage in the bill. In Sweden, the socialists proved even bigger traitors. Branting, the long-serving leader of the party, spared no effort to beat the idea that they should have political rights out of the heads of the women of the party, consoling them with the hope that women will only get the vote when socialism arrives. Poor Branting! If he only knew how he is being smeared by our equality campaigners. The equality campaigners have even more to say about the Austrians. Soyuz cites even the following sensational information: the Social Democrats even organized a meeting of women workers at which a resolution was adopted calling upon women who demanded the vote not to prevent a reform being carried out for men only. Thunderous was the indignation directed by the feminists at the Social Democratic Federation in Britain for refusing to support the feminist struggle for property qualified suffrage for women. In so doing, they of course forget that it is this party that energetically defends the interests of the most deprived and disenfranchised segment of the British population, demanding the vote for all adult citizens, male and female. In their indignation at the socialists, our equality campaigners are even willing to resort to outright libel. Thus, they level the following accusation at Quelch, a zealous campaigner for universal suffrage. This prominent member of the Social Democratic Party has spoken out many times against raising the demand for women's suffrage for the time being. Meanwhile, they give out against the members of the Social Democratic faction in the First and Third Duma for glossing over the demand without distinction as to sex in a few cases. With regard to the deliberate or accidental omission by Deputy IP Pokrovsky of the fifth member in the electoral formula, the equality campaigners give a lesson in political wisdom, insisting that, particularly in the Third Duma, it was significant to give a detailed discussion of electoral law, without totally unnecessarily omitting the formula adopted by the popular masses. The equality campaigners love to present themselves as Democrats, particularly when it entails no obligations for them. However, though the feminists have recorded all the slips and mistakes of the socialist parties in such detail, why are they incapable of also noting all the gains, the victories that women have made exclusively with the aid of the working class? Why do they not remember the successes of women's cause in Finland and Norway? Why do they not mention that it was only thanks to the efforts of the Social Democrats that the law, hated by women, banning their participation in political organizations fell at last in May 1908. The contributions of social democracy to the cause of women's political liberation are so obvious and indisputable that there is hardly any need to list them. But why on earth is it that our socialist-minded equality campaigners do not want to acknowledge these contributions? Surely, it is obvious even to them that it is in the interests of women's cause itself not to break up and split the forces of the proletariat by recruiting women of the working class to the ranks of bourgeois feminism. Of course, they know and understand that no less than we do, but, in this case, the feminists have less to say about the victory of women's cause than they do about their own class interests. The feminists only need proletarian women only as raw materials with which to build their stairway to the kingdom of their own bourgeois prosperity. And are not all means acceptable to that end? Even libeling socialists, seeking to split the forces of the proletariat by preaching discord between the sexes, and their fulsome praise for the peerlessly high mission of the pioneers of women's emancipation. But the feminists overestimate their forces and boast of their great contributions to no avail. Surely, we have seen that, in all areas of social life, whether in women's struggle for economic independence, the efforts to solve the complex family problem, or in the struggle for political equality for women, the contributions of bourgeois equality campaigners have been negligible. Working-class women have no reason to expect any tangible results for themselves from the successes of the feminist movement. Bourgeois feminism is powerless to liberate them as individuals, to improve their lot as sellers of labor power, or make the burden of motherhood any lighter for them. Women workers can only forge their happiness, as human beings and as women, with their own hands. But that happiness forged by proletarian women will inevitably become the legacy of all other women. This is why feminists, were they to give more than mere lip service to looking with eyes undimmed by class hatred at the gravely difficult struggle of the proletariat to liberate humanity from capitalist slavery, would have to joyfully salute every new victory of the workers. Then, the latent anger and class hatred for utopias living in the hearts of even left-wing champions of equal rights would disappear. Following the rocky road that brings the proletariat slowly, but surely, nearer to their coveted goal and ideal, the feminists should, filled with hope, cry out, "Your victory is our hope." Quoted in Die Frauenfrage. And their person as women of the haute bourgeoisie. However, despite all the commonalities in their demands for legal and political reforms, proletarian women have nothing in common with women of the other classes in relation to the decisive economic interests. Thus, the emancipation of proletarian women cannot be the work of women of all classes, rather, it is solely the task of the entire proletariat without distinction as to sex. Opening quotation mark here in original, apparent typo trans. Closing quotation mark in original, however, no opening quotation mark is present, so it is not entirely clear which words are being quoted. Trans. In the original, the declaration reads: 1. Men and women are born equally free and independent members of the human race, equally endowed with intelligence and ability and equally entitled to the free exercise of their individual rights and liberty. 2. The natural relation of the sexes is that of interdependence and cooperation, and the repression of the rights and liberty of one sex inevitably works injury to the other and hence to the whole race. 3. In all lands those laws, creeds, and customs which have tended to restrict women to a position of dependence, to discourage their education, to impede the development of their natural gifts and to subordinate their individuality have been based upon false theories and have produced an artificial and unjust relation of the sexes in modern society. 4. Self-government in the home and the state is the inalienable right of every normal adult, and the refusal of this right to women has resulted in social, legal, and economic injustice to them and has also intensified the existing economic disturbances throughout the world. 5. Governments which impose taxes and laws upon their women citizens without giving them the right of consent or dissent which is granted to men citizens exercise a tyranny inconsistent with just government. 6. The ballot is the only legal and permanent means of defending the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness pronounced inalienable by the American Declaration of Independence and accepted as inalienable by all civilized nations. In any representative form of government, therefore, women should be vested with all the political rights and privileges of electors. Erroneously phonetically rendered in the original as. The report of proceedings of the Congress states that the resolution was in fact 2 votes short of unanimity. Whereas, in France, during the Ancien Regime, women always had the same rights as men as owners of fiefs, they had the right to vote for communal and provincial assemblies under the same conditions. Women holding assets in their own name had been in possession of the vote for deputies to the États Généraux from its inception in 1302 until 1789, in accordance with the laws and customs of the provinces. At the time of the Revolution, women were stripped of rights they had enjoyed and exercised, and have not since had these rights restored. In 1848, when so-called universal suffrage was granted to men, women vainly protested against this law, which excludes more than half of the nation from any participation in public affairs and voting on taxes.